When people came to the execution, they believed that the empress was standing there, a woman who was deposed for treason. This is Evelina d'Arodel. The rumors didn't bother me. She really is a witch, judging by the color of her hair. Such a dark hair color does not exist, so that's what they thought. Her life was truly miserable. She was born in the Arga Empire into the family of Count Arodel. Their family wielded considerable power among the aristocracy, but all this did not mean much to her. Her father was very partial to women, so he acquired a decent number of bastards, and she was 19 of them. I got my appearance from my mother, except for the color of my eyes. Because of this, the Countess hated her. She lived her whole life as an unhappy, fragile child. But real horror awaited her after meeting him. The gentleman ordered her to greet the guy. In front of her was His Highness the Prince. He appeared suddenly, the other children trying their best to get his attention. Only Evelina was afraid of him, so she tried to avoid meeting him and not to catch his eye again. But, of all the Count's daughters, he took Evelina. She was 12 years old at the time, and he chose her as crown princess. Her father, who was thirsty for power, was only glad that after the man he wanted to see as emperor, his blood and flesh would be holy. So he immediately agreed, and a few years later, she became empress. After that, her father tried to make the emperor his puppet, but he was much smarter than her father. Over the course of 5 years, he strengthened his power, thereby driving the aristocratic party into a corner. And if it had ended there, he would have used her, born into an aristocratic family, flawlessly. And very insidiously, unexpectedly, rumors began to spread that Evelina was taking over all the riches from the treasury. She was accused of being responsible for the miscarriage of the emperor's mistress. She was always called a dark witch. It was the people themselves who came up with this name. One day, her father handed her a sandwich and asked her to take it. The girl, taking it in her hands, asked what it was. Father replied that it was me, and she asked again if he was really asking her to poison the emperor, and seemed to think that she would fall for this point. She said she had had enough, so her father got angry and started yelling at her. He started shouting to Evelina that the emperor had no intention of leaving them alive from the start, so they had to attack first. After this, a knight entered the room and ordered everyone to kneel, and the girl became frightened and began to believe that the emperor could hear all this. The gentleman turned to Count Arodel and said that if he behaved quietly, he promised to do everything quickly. The emperor swung his sword at him, and finally the count shouted that he was not a noble bastard. It seems the emperor has forgotten how the count helped him become emperor, and he has to thank him like this. The count asked again if he really thought he was destined to die so easily. He grabbed his daughter and tried to cover himself with her, but the emperor accidentally hit her. The knight immediately began to pursue him because the count began to run away. The servants were ordered to catch him abruptly. The emperor approached the girl and tried to take the bottle of poison. He told Evelina not to worry because they would definitely capture her father. He was shocked that the count decided to hide behind his daughter, and he thought it was some kind of shame. He said that it was all thanks to her, because she was his empress. In the end, the emperor won the victory, and all who spoke out against him were executed. The Arodel family was the stewards of the earth, and when they died, they cried out that it was all because of Evelina. They called her names and shouted that she was a creature that brought troubles. They started shouting that she should never have been born. And at the end of this mortally long and boring life, the money for her execution is on the table. The gentleman began to read that the empress had been overthrown and therefore executed. The death of the fallen ruler, Evelina d'Arodel. After which, the gentleman who was the coachman asked the lady to be more careful. It happened at night, so it was quite dark. The gentleman said that she could go out now. He called her by the correct name, but the lady stopped him. She said that this woman was already dead, and her name was now Anastasia. After this, another gentleman turned to Anastasia and said that he wanted to know where she would like to go. The lady remained silent at first, but then, after thinking about it, decided to answer. She said with a smile that she would go anywhere, as long as she was away from this city. She had already begun to think that this was all just a dream. She thought she heard the emperor addressing her, so she turned to him. Anastasia was simply shocked when she heard that he knew that she had survived. She couldn't believe her eyes. Casa and Gray lay dead at the emperor's feet. The emperor noticed that he had new toys. He pulled out his snake tongue and remarked that it was all thanks to Empress Anastasia, after which he said that he thought it was time for her to go to the next world. He also said that everything should be as it was intended from the very beginning. The girl was simply horrified and could not believe what was happening. She said she didn't agree with this, after which she finally woke up. This is a damn prophetic dream. Similar nightmares have haunted Anastasia since early childhood. Although Anastasia could not see the future she wanted for herself, this skill sometimes helped her out. Thus, she knew in advance that she was destined to become empress and die on the chopping block. However, she was unable to change what was destined. Only after meeting death as a deposed empress was Anastasia able to gain freedom, all thanks to a doll an alchemist created for her. She then ended up in the Terran Empire, which is at odds with Arga, and she became the owner of the largest trading guild, Chaos. 5 years have passed since then. To her misfortune, the Emperor continues to appear to her in her dreams. And this prophetic dream reminds her that this is not the end. But now, Anastasia is no longer that powerless empress. Anastasia has the strength to fight this. So she decided that she would protect everyone, even if it meant putting her own life on the line. A year ago, during a meeting with Duke Aton, he noticed that the owner of the Merchant Guild was a woman. This was the guild everyone was so desperate to get their hands on. He asked again if her name was really Anastasia. The lady confirmed this. This duke was a special person. There has never been a single duke in his family who wasn't skilled in the art of the sword. The fact is, the duchy has been raising swordsmen for generations, and their abilities are the guarantee of Anastasia's protection, so she needs the duke. The gentleman asked how she could help him resolve the land issue. He had already approached other guilds, but no one had been able to do this for him. Anastasia noted that she had not had any failures so far. Anastasia also heard that the duke swore in the name of the duke that he would do anything if the weather issue on his lands was resolved. The gentleman replied that everything was exactly as it was, so Anastasia said she would believe his words. She also provided her terms if their deal ended on a good note. The duke said that if she failed after this, he swears in the duke's name that he will not let her go. Anastasia smiled and remarked that they wouldn't disappoint him. It was a bold statement, so the gentleman hoped it wasn't just words. The lady told the duke that chaos never throws words to the wind. He would soon see this for himself. Otherwise, they wouldn't have become the best guild on the continent. In the north, one always has to contend with severe cold. Until now, no one has dared to claim a solution to this problem. So the butler decided to ask again if the master thought they could handle it. The duke noted that since Anastasia said so, then that's how it would be. Almost a year has passed since the meeting with Duke Atan. The construction was almost complete. Someone knocked on the lady's door, and she allowed entry. The servant informed Lady Anastasia that a man from Duke Atan's estate had arrived, and he conveyed that the promise would be kept. So it was now Anastasia's turn to receive gifts. She's finally caught Duke Atan. It looks like she's had another prophetic dream. But Anastasia had no idea where she was. It looked like a battlefield. She heard voices, so she looked around to see who was there. There, she saw a young gentleman with dark hair. He started attacking men and blood was flowing before her eyes. This man dealt with all the knights single-handedly. Judging by his look, this is a normal action for him. He looks as if nothing happened. But suddenly, the place changed. She saw a light, after which I saw a naked guy in a towel, but only his back was visible. Still, she didn't understand what it meant. This sight made Anastasia feel uneasy. She couldn't understand if this was really a dream or why she was dreaming like this at all. She really wanted to open her eyes to wake up in the real world. Then, the guy turned to her. Anastasia was still trying to do something to wake up. But she also realized that this was the same man from the battlefield, and he was now looking straight at Anastasia. After this, Anastasia finally woke up. She sighed and didn't understand what kind of dream it was. She wondered if he was prophetic or if it was just her imagination. It might just be a matter of her unmet needs. However, there is no point in thinking about it because this man continued to appear to her in dreams. When her fear of the emperor plunged her into the abyss, this mysterious man appeared. When she looked into the eyes of this man who seemed to be afraid of nothing in this world, she felt as if she were behind a stone wall. On days like these, Anastasia could sleep peacefully without thinking about anything. A man with dark eyes and hair. Anastasia would very much like to know who he was. In the Chaos Guild, Lord Chaos turned to Lady Anastasia. He said that if she stared at the documents, nothing would change. She also asked why Atan died. The gentleman said it was all due to old age. He died just a week before the contract was to be fulfilled. She was a little surprised because she hadn't seen it in her dream. Anastasia was also angry that those damn dreams didn't warn her about his death. And so it always is. Anastasia finally decided to find out how things were going with the heir. The man said that he seemed to have gone to seek the emperor's blessing. However, the informant failed to obtain information about him. It's as if this man doesn't even exist. The lady said it's a line of swordsmen. Anastasia told no one to come near him because it was dangerous. After which she turned to Gray and asked how old the man who would become the next duke was. The man replied that he was 30 years old. The woman also asked how likely it was that he preferred men. Gray replied that the probability was 0. Then Anastasia decided to ask what the likelihood was that he wasn't interested in women in general. Gray didn't know this because they couldn't find any information on the matter. It's hard to say anything yet. The lady remained silent at first, but then said that in that case she would go there. North, Duchy of Aton, the Tojo party requests an audience with his lordship. They've been getting on his nerves lately. The gentleman also inquired about the rats on the estate. The butler replied that everyone had been caught, and so the gentleman asked again whether they had found out who was behind it. Unfortunately, it has not been confirmed yet. It looks like they belong to the aristocratic Tuho party. The Duke of Dean's capital side is also suspicious, and yet he maintained until the very end that they were approaching the Duke's bathroom. The guy was surprised, but didn't show it. After which the butler asked the gentleman again what they would do. The gentleman calmly replied that he knew it himself. Then the butler said that he understood him and bowed to him. After which the gentleman turned to Jack when he had almost left the room. He said that people from the Chaos Trade Guild had arrived here. Jack was surprised and asked again if he had understood his master correctly. The gentleman, meanwhile, simply asked the butler to call them to him. The butler greeted the lady and her servants and was glad to see them. The man apologized for not warning them about his visit. The butler said that everything was fine and that they were already expected. At first the gentleman was surprised, but when they entered, he didn't show it. The butler noticed with interest that these three had clearly not been introduced before, and this immediately caught his attention. He couldn't help but notice that they looked unusual. He announced in a measured tone that the new duke, Can von Aton, was now standing before them. His words immediately caught the attention of everyone present, as it was an important announcement. The lady was shocked, unable to believe her eyes. She couldn't believe that this was really the young man who had appeared in her dreams so many times. It seemed unreal. She clearly remembered him from her dreams, and now he stood before her. It was that same boy, and it seemed he really was the new duke, as the butler had said. The gentleman greeted His Grace, Duke Aton. He introduced himself as Gray Reed, the leader of the Chaos Guild. The lady, meanwhile, was shocked that this man was looking at her and not at Gray. The man offered his condolences to him, but the duke demanded that he get to the point. The lady smiled and took off her robe. He seemed to know that she was the head of the guild and asked for forgiveness. She asked permission to introduce herself and said that she was in fact the head of the guild. Then the gentleman asked her what she wanted, and the lady said that no deal had been made with the late duke. And according to this deal, if his problem is solved, she will receive his protection. As she promised, she did her part. However, the duke died suddenly, so she wants him to fulfill his obligations. The gentleman said that he agreed. The girl was surprised that he agreed so quickly. He noted that she would become his ward to me and his mistress. Anastasia was in complete shock and even opened her mouth at his words. She began to believe that he was going to use her as a shield against Tuho. She noted that this is a countermeasure against any opportunities and troubles. For example, a potential bride. The duke then remarked that she was truly intelligent. The girl also said that she had already fulfilled her part of the contract. Now it was his turn, and she also asked why he decided that it would agree to such conditions. The duke replied that it was all because of this, that she had no choice at all. Anastasia said that she is the head of the Chaos Guild, and it seems he thinks that there is something that she cannot do. The duke asked why the head of such a powerful guild was revealing his true form. Hoping to capture Duke Aton, this man doesn't look like he's just recently assumed the position of duke. It is a pity that we were unable to obtain information in advance, and all that remains is to fight. She approached his lordship and said that in a case where the contract price had already been paid, putting forward new conditions would call into question trust. She asked where the guarantee was that new conditions would not emerge. The duke said it was interesting, and asked what she was proposing. Anastasia heard that a contract concluded at the temple is no different from an oath, and he bets his life on the console until the terms of the contract are fulfilled, and the heart of the one who violates it will be torn apart by divine power. The lady noted that there really is no more perfect contract than this one. Therefore, she would like to know if he agrees to conclude it. The gentleman said that he agreed, and since the lady had already fulfilled her conditions, she would be asked to make new ones, and she would like to adjust her part equally. She asked if his lordship wished to share his bed with her. Does she want to give it up? Anastasia said that she wants to give up on it. She doesn't want to sleep with him. But if everything is mutual, and only if necessary, then she agrees. Then she asked again if they accepted these conditions, and the Duke said that he, of course, agreed. But he asked about something else. He asked what would happen if she was the first to ask for it. The girl said that of course it was not for nothing that they called him the Duke of Earthly Beauty, but everyone has different tastes. The lady said not to worry because she would not cross that line. The Duke then said that this was indeed a bold statement, and he was not sure that one could control one's attraction. Anastasia said that she gained experience in this. She had been to the other side, but the Duke did not understand what she was talking about. The lady said she was simply referring to a divorce. She wouldn't do anything that would jeopardize their contract. Because she doesn't need any problems at all, now she needs to sign the contract. It seems like she really wants this contract. But it's better not to betray the Duke, unless, of course, her life is dear to her. After that, he signed the contract. The lady said that she of course agreed with him. She also said at parting that she would eagerly await a response from the temple. The gentleman told her that he understood her perfectly, after which she decided to take her leave only, but the Duke said that he wanted to ask something else, and Madame Anastasia turned to him. She was surprised that there was anything else of interest about the contract. The Duke meanwhile asked if she was a voyeur. The lady was simply shocked. The gentleman said that he would consider this as an answer, but she didn't even say anything. He didn't even hear footsteps. Someone approached him so quietly that the air didn't move. Not a rustle, not a shadow on the floor, not the slightest movement to betray their presence. But he knew one thing for sure. It was a woman. The invisible presence, the light, almost elusive scent, everything pointed to it. And this woman turned out to be no random person, but the guild leader herself. While they spoke, he tested her, trying to use his energy, but he encountered emptiness, as if she weren't human. It definitely wasn't a protective spell, as even the most powerful barriers left barely noticeable traces. This meant she was somehow able to suppress magic or conceal her own powers. But that seemed impossible. If she really was blocking his abilities, then it would be hard to call her an ordinary person. There simply weren't anyone like her. Moreover, if she possessed such incredible power, she would have had no reason to agree to this contract. She was clearly afraid of him. Her hands trembled, but the will to live burned in her eyes. She led a guild that could provide him with anything he desired. So what could such a woman fear? What made her look like she was walking on the edge of an abyss? He turned to Jack, suggesting that the woman was the daughter of a baron who had long since fallen from grace. The servant reported that, according to their information, this was indeed the case. At first glance, the information seemed to match, but something about this woman troubled the Duke. So he ordered Jack to double-check everything. This time, to dig deeper, to find out what might have been hidden. Dvoretsky asked whether the gentleman wanted the investigation to start from scratch, from the very beginning. The Duke raised an eyebrow in surprise and replied that he was amazed that Jack dared to answer a question with a question. Realizing his mistake, the butler apologized, bowed his head, and without hesitation turned around to get down to business immediately. When he left, the Duke thought of that woman again. She was a riddle, a mystery he wanted to unravel. Her bold, unexpected offer to share his bed flashed through his mind. He remembered her face at that moment. The corners of his lips twitched into a smile. Now he was even more eager to know what lay behind that mask. Anastasia was at a loss when she was accused of lying. She tried to claim she was seeing this man for the first time, but her voice betrayed her. The situation was tense, and the more she insisted on denying her involvement, the more it seemed she was hiding something. The gentleman, observing her reaction, immediately noticed a change in her demeanor. She became especially agitated when the conversation turned to voyeurism. He chuckled and concluded that she clearly had something to hide, even if she tried to deny it. But who gave him the right to judge her anyway? This man hadn't even been able to rein in the Duke himself, and now he was trying to teach her a lesson. Anastasia was outraged by his behavior, but arguing with him was pointless. In response, he merely shrugged and, with an indifferent smile, declared that he was merely a mercenary, not a swordsman. Therefore, he was beyond the power to try to put the Duke in his place. And besides, he had no desire to die because of stupidity. Gray, not hiding his concern, turned to his mistress. he quietly remarked that the Duke's family was shrouded in secrets that no one dared speak of aloud. Even the servants in their household preferred not to discuss their master's affairs. The only thing that was known for sure was that all the men in their family were outstanding swordsmen. This skill was passed down from generation to generation, making them formidable and dangerous opponents. However, the women who became their wives rarely enjoyed happy and carefree lives. Their fates were complicated, and each of them faced difficulties that were the subject of dark rumors. Even though the Duke was sweating from his workout, he still looked incredibly attractive. There was something captivating about his appearance, even though the years hadn't passed him by. But despite his attractiveness, he never showed any interest in women. That's why the Duke didn't worry about his reputation. He simply didn't care what others thought of him. As for the new Duke, his appearance was questionable. However, saying this out loud would be extremely tactless, but it seems the lady has already made this mistake. Anastasia turned away, lost in thought. How could she have actually said something like that? She hadn't expected to trust them so much, and it scared her a little. However, no matter how hard she tried to hide it, she was still concerned about this relationship. She understood this man's feelings perfectly, even if she couldn't share them completely. She needs him, and she has no choice. Even if he's a dangerous ally, she can't do without him. Grey confidently declared that, although their guild is inferior to the Duke in strength, they are capable of subjugating his army if they play their cards right. Emperor Arga is her enemy, and fighting him may prove hopeless. If they are defeated, not only will their lives be in danger, but the guild's status will crumble. Then other countries will stop taking them seriously. They can't afford to destroy an entire empire. It's too risky. The lady speaks of threats, and there's a firmness in her voice. They must be careful, because one mistake could cost them everything. She has no right to endanger her people. These people trust her, follow her, and therefore she has a duty to protect them. They should not suffer because of her past, no matter how dark it may be. Grey noted that, despite this, one mustn't let one's guard down. The enemy could already be close. One must be prepared for anything, because betrayal could come from where one least expects it. When the butler invited them, his words were strange. He spoke as if he already knew they were coming. It couldn't be a coincidence. How could he have known about them in advance? He immediately announced that they were expected. This meant one thing. The Duke had information about her. Perhaps he even suspected her true identity. This was a worrying sign. Now their informants will have to be even more vigilant. Every little detail could prove important. The enemy is watching, which means they, too, need to monitor their every move. However, the lady didn't share this concern. She didn't see any need to change anything. If her identity was revealed, so be it. She had no intention of hiding any longer. Grey was shocked by her words. He tried to say something, but he knew her decision was final. She wasn't afraid of the consequences. The lady calmly stated that the Duke was unlikely to be too concerned about this. All secrets eventually come to light, and she had long been prepared for this. The only thing that truly troubled her was how he recognized her. Perhaps the events she thought were a dream were real. Perhaps it wasn't just a vision. It's possible she was actually observing real events unfolding at that very moment. And if so, things are much more complicated than she thought. Grey looked at Anastasia with slight concern and cautiously asked if something was bothering her. He had long been able to read her mood and saw that she was thoughtful. Anastasia quickly replied that everything was fine, but she continued to ponder. If she had dreamed of him, then perhaps it was a sign that she was on the right path. In novels, such things are called fate, when signs lead to the only right decision, but in reality, everything is not so simple. The man sitting next to her shook his head in bewilderment, not understanding how the lady could have agreed to such a thing. Another participant in the conversation thoughtfully noted that perhaps she was missing something since she went along with it. After all, if a woman decides to become the Duke's mistress, it means she has a good reason for it. Anastasia calmly asked not to jump to conclusions, since she simply had no choice in this situation. The men looked at each other, not understanding what she meant, because, in their opinion, if a person is a master of the sword, then he can stand up for himself. They believed that if the Duke simply wasn't suited to his mistress, it would be understandable, especially since she had money and was quite striking in appearance. Their words made Anastasia feel uneasy. These conversations were unpleasant, but she remained unperturbed. However, some were convinced that no matter how good a swordsman was, even 100 fighters wouldn't save him in such a situation. Suddenly, Anastasia slammed her hand on the table, cutting off the discussion. She firmly declared that she had had enough of this empty talk. The meeting was over for today because there was simply nothing further to discuss. Obviously, convincing those present would not be easy, but there was no point in arguing with them now. Standing up, Anastasia headed towards the exit and instructed Gray to complete all remaining business before leaving the room. Anastasia knew Gray was going through a tough time. He'd always been a reliable assistant, but now the situation was simply catastrophic. These people didn't understand how to work with them, and Gray had to deal with everything alone, maintaining order. He believed that with time they would sort things out and understand everything. But perhaps they shouldn't have behaved this way, causing even more questions and tension. They needed to calm down and focus on the main thing, not create new problems. The men began whispering among themselves, worried about what was happening. They were worried about what would happen next and how it would all end. They couldn't just stand by and wait, not knowing where this was going. Gray, noticing their doubts, asked what exactly they were unclear about the lady's actions. He couldn't understand why they doubted her, since Anastasia always acted in their interests. Hadn't she already proven that time and again? However, there were those among them who weren't entirely sure. Was she really doing all this for them? Or did she have another goal they weren't aware of? Mistrust, however slight, hung in the air. Then one of the men spoke up, mentioning that he'd heard rumors. It was said that the Arga aristocracy had recently begun to take active action. Perhaps this had something to do with what was happening now. To be more precise, the emperor himself intervened. They couldn't say exactly what he had in mind, but it was clear that something was changing, and events were indeed unfolding exactly as they had predicted. Gray nodded, confirming their suspicions. Yes, Quan was observant and had noticed something important. The lady had indeed said this was necessary, so all they had to do was watch how things unfolded. If Anastasia decided this was necessary, they had no choice but to accept it. They could only observe her actions and trust her as they had before. Moreover, several years ago they had experienced a terrible famine. That time left a deep mark on them. They remembered what it was like to be left without food and without hope for the future. One of the men recalled how he himself had to leave his family to survive. It wasn't an easy decision, but he had no other choice. It was then that he realized how cruel this world really is. Without Anastasia, they wouldn't be where they are today. It was she who helped them get back on their feet, survive, and find purpose. Without her, their fates would have been completely different, and they knew it perfectly well. That's why they made a vow that day. They swore that if she helped them survive, they would pledge their allegiance to her. That moment changed their lives. They swore to serve her and follow her to the end. If she could help them solve their problems, they would dedicate their lives to her, for Anastasia had already done too much for them to betray her trust. The boy looked at her closely and noticed that the whole situation seemed strange to him, no matter how he looked at it. He couldn't understand what could have so captivated the Duke. Anastasia frowned at his words and asked what exactly he was talking about. He shrugged and said he didn't know what he could have done to attract such a man's attention, especially when it came to the Duke himself. Anastasia paused and asked if she really looked so pathetic in his eyes that it could evoke pity or interest. She tried to understand the reason for his words, but he only chuckled and said there was no point in thinking about it. It was better to just forget it and not worry about it. Even when she openly declared that no one was obligated to stay by her side and that everyone could live as they wished, no one left. They continued to remain under her command. The reason was obvious. They all loved being around her. Everyone who stayed owed her something. She had saved them, given them a new life, and they couldn't just leave, including him. That's why she must remember this and not doubt the devotion of those around her. They are here not out of duty, but out of gratitude. Without her, he simply wouldn't have survived. This fact was obvious to him. He understood that he owed her everything. And these weren't just beautiful words, but the truth. So he decided to stay by her side and be her sword, her protection, her weapon. He had no doubt about his choice and had no intention of retreating. It was up to her to decide whether to sheathe the sword or use it. He would follow her, regardless of her decision, because he considered her worthy. Hearing this, she calmly replied that there was no need for that. He didn't have to fight for her. He just had to stay by her side and be who he was. And Duke Aitan will be her shield. The boy was surprised to hear this and quietly asked if his mistress truly believed in him and his loyalty so much. She answered simply and without a shadow of a doubt. She simply had no other choice. The Rubicon has already been crossed, and there is no turning back. Only those who don't give up today, who can endure all trials and persevere to the end, will see tomorrow. This world has no place for the weak, which means only the strongest will survive. Anastasia understood this better than anyone. She wasn't going to give up, even if she was surrounded on all sides. The war wasn't over yet, which meant there was no retreat. She would fight until her last breath, protecting those who needed her. She wouldn't just protect her people, she'd do everything to survive herself. Not for glory or power, but because so much depended on her. If she fell, her guild would collapse, and she couldn't allow that. Butler Jack returned with a report, but he had no news. There was no information from the Empire, as if someone was carefully concealing anything that might shed light on the situation. This was alarming, but there was no choice but to continue the search. It would likely take more time to obtain the necessary information. It was obvious someone had been diligently covering their tracks. We'd have to send our own people there, which meant training them and providing them with the necessary resources. Khan Aton, after listening to the report, merely nodded. He had expected such an answer, and so he agreed without further ado. But Jack didn't stop there. He had another important question that was nagging at him. The butler inquired whether the gentleman truly intended to swear allegiance to the temple. This decision seemed odd, as Khan had never previously shown much respect for the church, and now he was about to enter into a treaty with it. Holy power couldn't be mixed with the Atan clan's mine. The consequences could be unpredictable. It could hurt, make him vulnerable, or even weaken him. Was it worth it, especially for a stranger? But the Duke merely shrugged. He calmly declared that it made no difference to him. If it was necessary to achieve his goals, he would do whatever it took, even if it entailed risk. He also instructed me to convey that the meeting at the temple would take place in a week. This meant that decisions had already been made, and he had no intention of backing down. Everything must proceed according to plan, without unnecessary doubts or hesitation. Anastasia looked closely at the Duke and asked if he had anything to say to her before meeting the priest. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were expectant. She wanted to hear something important. Khan slowly turned to face her, and in that moment her thoughts momentarily slipped away. She looked at him, and the strange dream that had been haunting her flashed before her eyes. Her mind was drawn back to those images. Just looking at him brought back memories of the dream, as if it wasn't just a dream, but something greater, something that was meant to happen. She pushed those thoughts away sharply, unwilling to indulge in such fantasies. A naked male body was too bold, too unusual. She'd never seen anything like it and didn't know how to react. Ken noticed her strange expression and frowned. He couldn't understand what she was thinking, but suddenly something flashed in her eyes that made him wonder. What kind of absurd thoughts were swirling through her head? Anastasia suddenly snapped out of her reverie and declared irritably that this was simply inappropriate. She'd never spied on anyone before and had no intention of starting now. But why was her heart beating so fast? The gentleman finally understood what they were talking about. He realized that this wasn't just a conversation, but a specific situation that needed to be analyzed and understood. He thought she was denying it all, as if she didn't understand the essence of the matter, but in fact he was confident in his conclusions. The lady confirmed his words, adding that she had indeed never met him before, and therefore it was unfair to blame her for what he said. The gentleman smiled back. His smile was slightly mocking, but mostly benevolent, as he understood why Anastasia so persistently denied everything. She tried again to explain that things weren't as he thought, but he pointed out that everyone is guaranteed the right to freedom and privacy in their personal lives. It was the first time he had encountered such an unusual and frank contract, and he did not hide his surprise. He wanted to say that this was exactly what was being discussed, but she, hearing his remarks, opened her mouth in surprise, not expecting such a turn of events. She didn't know what to say because the terms of the contract were so vague they could lead to misunderstandings. So she decided to be as clear as possible. She clarified that everyone has the right to a free personal life and privacy. Everything was stated clearly without unnecessary words. To be honest, she didn't know much about relationships, and her memories of marriage weren't the best, but that didn't mean she hated men. If her vision had been limited, the guild would not have reached the position it has. Her ability to make difficult decisions was essential to its success. Anastasia was perfectly aware that there was no room for emotion in this contract. It was purely practical, designed to avoid inconvenience for both parties. It was for this reason that she added this clause to the contract. And, addressing the gentleman, she apologized if this proved too difficult for him. Mr. Can stated that he accepted her terms, and she asked doubtfully whether he wanted to change any points of the contract. For example, Khan suggested making the contract less obscene, but added that he'd had enough of it already. His words were confident enough, and he had no plans to change the terms. He suddenly asked again if Anastasia trusted him right now. The question was unexpected and made her pause for a moment, but she answered him anyway. The lady, without hesitation, replied that this was not so. Her words were direct, without further thought, and it was clear that she did not have such trust. This honest answer surprised him. He hadn't expected Anastasia to be so frank, and despite all his confidence, he felt a slight disappointment. She noted that, in principle, his lordship hadn't signed the contract with complete confidence either. This was obvious, and her words reinforced her position. Ken replied that that wasn't true at all. He was simply curious and wanted to understand the reason behind this decision. What made her so confident? The world was simple. Only the strongest survive. This thought flashed through his mind more than once as he observed the world around him, full of struggle and cruelty. Khan was always at the top. There was no room for weakness or compromise in his life. He was accustomed to being a leader and never stooped below his level. This is precisely what made his life boring and predictable. He didn't know what it meant to struggle or push himself to the brink. Everything went according to a predetermined plan. But Anastasia was different. She seemed so fragile, as if she could break at a single touch, yet there was a special strength in her eyes. Khan couldn't understand where she got such a will to live. She added a little saltiness to his life that he sorely needed, and it made him think. He became curious about how far this could go. He was intrigued by her behavior and tried to understand what really lay behind her determination. Anastasia thought it might have been a warning. She couldn't quite understand what was happening, but she sensed that things weren't as simple as they seemed. The gentleman said it was time for them to go, but Anastasia wondered, was she doing the right thing? Should she continue on this path? In the end, he was her only option. Despite all her doubts, she knew she had no other choice, and this was her decision. She had no intention of regretting it. Even if her actions were wrong, she wouldn't look back because her choice was conscious. After several rituals, the man announced that the oath had been taken. This meant that everything was complete, and there was no turning back. Everything had changed. Duke Khan Aton was grateful for the assistance given to him. He knew that with this money his affairs would improve, and he would be able to repay his debt. The Duke promised that all proceeds would be used for the needs of the church, and his belief in the nobility of this act was firm. This was an important step for him. After these words, Anastasia decided it was time to move on. She knew they couldn't linger too long. There were important matters ahead. But the Duke, without letting go of her hand, decided to stop her. He said he had to congratulate her. After all, she was now a part of his life, the Duke's woman. His words were serious, and he warned her that if she broke his promise, her heart would be broken. It wasn't just a threat, but a warning. Anastasia, without hesitation, replied that the Duke had better take care of his own health, lest he himself find himself on the brink of death. She didn't want to hear such words. Gray, standing nearby, cautiously suggested that since the lady had decided to stay in the Duke's house, perhaps they should think about moving the guild headquarters. However, Anastasia was adamant. She immediately replied that she would not agree to this. The guild must remain in the capital. After all, it had only recently been founded in Terran. She added that the guild needed to monitor the activities of Arga's aristocracy. It was their direct responsibility, and Gray must obey her decisions without further ado. He had to understand that she had made the decision to stay here and be his lover. She didn't expect him to resist or try to change her. He asked her not to overload herself with tasks. He reminded her that if she felt tired, she could always delegate some of the work to him. When she tried to do everything herself, it hurt him to see how exhausted she was. He didn't know how to help, but he still worried about her. Gradually, he began to feel like he played no role in her life. He didn't know what she needed and felt like he'd become superfluous. She wanted to tell him about it, but decided to do it differently. She took his hand and confidently told him that she needed him, no matter what. She had already seen the future in her dreams, but it was hazy and unsettling. She sensed difficulties awaiting her, even though she didn't want them. She turned to the edge, despair in her voice. He had become her father's replacement, and she could no longer imagine her life without him. But he, too, had his own life and his own affairs. She couldn't influence his choices, so she suggested he return when he'd finished his business. Gray announced that he and Cass would go first. He was prepared for this, even though he knew the journey wouldn't be easy, and it was only just beginning. The stories of ducal women always ended badly, and Aton's mother was no exception. He didn't want to repeat the fate of his predecessors. If he developed feelings stronger than just interest, he knew that she too could face a terrible future, just like everyone else. She should have understood that it was her choice and should not regret the consequences if things did not go as she expected. After all, she herself approached him. She herself sought out meetings, and now she was forced to bear the consequences of her decisions. The choice was always hers, and therefore the responsibility for everything that happened also lay on her shoulders. She hoped that he would always be there, supporting her, because she could not imagine her life without him, even in the most difficult moments. He said he needed some time to think. It was a big decision, and he needed to figure out what would happen next. She also suspected that he might have developed feelings for the Duke. She didn't know how to react to this, but she suspected there was something there. However, the young man was outraged by her assumption. He was certain that, despite the Duke's beauty, he had no interest in men. Suddenly, their path was interrupted. Anastasia couldn't understand why they had stopped, and she sensed that something was wrong. She felt uneasy. She peered out of the carriage to see what had happened. Her gaze immediately fell on the situation that had caused the delay. She thought perhaps someone had simply gotten in their way, preventing them from continuing. However, the situation seemed more tense. Anastasia screamed and asked Casa for help when she noticed the man swinging at their coachman. It was dangerous, and she couldn't stand by. Casa quickly intervened to protect the coachman, and the man asked in surprise who this man was who dared to interfere with his actions. The man obviously didn't expect anyone to dare confront him. Apparently, he didn't know what to do with an equal. He was astonished. How could a knight threaten a defenseless child with a sword? To him it seemed absurd, even boring. He assured that the coachman was not to blame, and having calmed the situation, said that he could continue on his way and return to his mistress. The man, who was ready to attack, began to get indignant, claiming that the guy simply approached the cart without permission and asked him to move away. He continued to shout that the guy was rude to him and even demanded that he move away from Count Brill himself, which only added fuel to the fire. The man couldn't understand how Casa dared to defend this guy, because for him it was an unacceptable act that had no justification. Casa asked again what the worldly bastard had said, clearly irritated by the behavior of a man he considered insignificant. The lady realized that the conversation would drag on for a long time and, sighing sadly, she prepared herself for the fact that they would still have to spend quite a bit of time here. She offered everyone a little snack, trying to soften the situation, and began feeding the coachman so that he would not feel forgotten. As she watched this, she couldn't help but notice that Casa seemed to have no patience for people like this man. His disgust was obvious. Casa gave the man an angry look, hoping that he would think for himself and not make such mistakes in the future. He was surprised that with such skills this man even dared to call himself a knight. And of course he couldn't ignore it. The coachman, noticing what was happening, decided it would drag on forever. It seemed Mr. Cassia was truly bored. The lady wondered whether she should intervene and stop him, or let Cassia continue and scold this presumptuous knight. The coachman nevertheless reminded them that they were late for the Duke, and he did not want Madame Anastasia to be reprimanded for being late. Anastasia, smiling, asked Cassia to stop this, knowing that their time was limited and they needed to be more restrained. Casa smiled back and said innocently that he hadn't even started yet, and a look of mischief could be seen on his face. Anastasia, realizing that he had gotten too carried away, told him that he should stop, as the situation could get out of control. Apparently, the carriage was being repaired, and Anastasia remembered that she knew some people from her guild who could help them. She suggested contacting these friends because they wouldn't charge for the repairs and it would be much more convenient for them. When she remembered the name of Count Brill, she thought, because this family was expelled from the capital and sent to the north, deprived of their former position. Her thoughts about the Count were full of doubts, because despite the fact that they had lost a lot, they still retained their pride and nobility. The man said the Count told him he wouldn't investigate the incident. He promised not to interfere, but he couldn't ignore the situation. The man admitted he can't simply ignore people's rude behavior, especially when it puts safety at risk. He offered his own solution. He suggested that they agree on one solution that might satisfy everyone, suggesting as a possible solution the shared use of a wheel from their cart. Anastasia, not understanding the meaning of the proposal, merely smiled quietly. She saw no point in his words and remained calm, showing no emotion. She noted that the wheel they were about to fix didn't look broken anyway, despite the man's insistence that it needed attention. But her words fell on deaf ears. The man took her refusal as a negative answer, but still asked if she would continue discussing the proposal. He was waiting for her final decision. Anastasia didn't argue, and replied that they'd simply break the wheel if it got in the way. The solution was simple and quick, without further ado. She added that there was no need to worry, as her team was very experienced and would handle the task without any problems. Experience and confidence were her keys to success. She assured the man that no one in the carriage would be harmed, even if the wheel did require attention. Everything would be done carefully and safely. Anastasia turned to Kasia to get started without wasting any time. She remained focused on solving the problem, even if it caused dissatisfaction among others. The man slowed, trying to figure out what was going on. Kasia quietly remarked that if he hit the wheel again, it might crack or break, making the situation worse. Anastasia insisted that Kasia continue, ignoring his misgivings. At that moment, the Count emerged from the carriage, accompanied by loud shouts, attracting the attention of those around him. Anastasia, seeing the Count, felt relieved, thinking that now everything would be resolved. She believed that his daughter was with him, and that was the important thing. Anastasia's gaze fell on the girl's outfit, and she immediately realized this meeting was no coincidence. They were on their way to meet Duke Aton, and this was an important event. Anastasia greeted the Count and his daughter, introducing herself as a representative of Duke Aton's family. This was the moment when everything could change, and she was ready to act. The Count was outraged that someone was throwing a hammer at a carriage with people inside. Anastasia merely smiled quietly in response, unfazed by his outrage. She explained that she tried to act quickly because they had asked for the wheel to be returned. A quick solution was essential to avoid further delays and problems. They weren't expecting her to show up, and Anastasia quickly apologized. She was rushing to meet the Duke and added that they could get there even without one wheel. The Duke asked her purpose for coming to him. The lady responded with a smile, concealing all her thoughts and fears. Anastasia explained that she had been invited and noted that this was precisely why they were also going to see the Duke. It's simple. Count Brill's daughter was stunned. She couldn't believe this girl had received an invitation from the Duke himself. It seemed incredible. Isabella remembered that the Duke also had dark hair. Perhaps she was related to him? Doubts persisted. Anastasia looked like a simple village girl, as if she belonged to some baron's family. This didn't inspire confidence, but Isabella's intuition still made her feel uneasy. And at some point, Anastasia, apparently noticing her tension, asked again where they were headed. The man replied that their path lay to the Duchy of Aton, which seemed quite logical. Anastasia noticed that their routes overlapped and offered to transfer to their carriage. It was convenient and reasonable. Then the wheels wouldn't have to be divided, but the man didn't seem ready to accept such help, saying it was too much. In response, Isabella, suppressing her gratitude, said that it was too generous of her. They couldn't refuse. She thanked Anastasia for her help, to which the lady replied with a smile that if this could be considered help, she would be glad. Anastasia von Isaac. Isabella hadn't heard that name among high-ranking aristocrats. There was something mysterious about it. Anastasia received an unexpected invitation from the Duke himself, which was a big surprise for her, since it was rare for anyone to attract his attention. Kasia couldn't resist asking why the lady had decided to contact the Duke and, it seemed, let them down in this matter. He sought an explanation for her actions. She told him that all this was necessary to fulfill the terms of the contract she had signed. The answer was cryptic but convincing. Isabella didn't stand aside and inquired about Anastasia's relationship with this man. She couldn't help but ask. And although their relationship was obviously not a work one, Isabella still couldn't understand how to perceive their relationship, not as subordinate and employer, but as something else. Anastasia smiled and explained that Kasia was her loyal friend and companion. This answer immediately dotted the I's, and Isabella understood. She noticed that recently older women often like younger men, but admitted that this was the first time she had seen such a couple with her own eyes. Kasia was a little irritated to hear these words. He couldn't resist remarking that she was too talkative and perhaps she should just shut up and get into the carriage. The Count could not help but notice that Kasia, being a subordinate of Madame Anastasia, was behaving too familiarly with her, which, in his opinion, was not entirely appropriate. Anastasia, sensing the tension, apologized to the Count, explaining that there was nothing she could do about it. It was simply the way their relationship had developed. The Count was astonished to hear that this young man was a top-class mercenary. It was more than he could have imagined. There were only 3 such mercenaries in the world, and they were extremely difficult to hire, even with exorbitant prices. This only heightened interest. The Count examined Kasia carefully and noticed that he had scarlet eyes and hair, which immediately caught his attention. This was extremely unusual. He began to suspect that this was the very scarlet fox he'd been hearing about. This discovery truly surprised him. The Count explained that he hadn't introduced himself properly, so they hadn't recognized him right away. It was awkward, but he hoped they would forgive him for the misunderstanding. The Count asked Kasia to forgive their night just this once, explaining that it was an accidental conflict. He didn't want it to tarnish their relationship. Anastasia, wasting no time, turned to Isabella and gently told her that it was time for them to go. After all, she knew the Duke had been waiting for them for a long time. They had to be on time. Isabella was outraged. This impudent girl was talking to her like that. She would have gladly answered, but she wasn't in the mood right now because of the ball. At that moment, Anastasia's servant, Gray, approached and announced that they had arrived. Everything was ready, and their meeting with the Duke was not long in coming. Isabella, assessing the Duke's mansion, quietly remarked that for someone living on the border, it was quite a nice house. It was impressive and beautiful. The Count, trying to figure out where the Duke himself was, continued to scan the area. And at that moment, their gaze fell on a very tall man. When Isabella saw this man, she was shocked. She couldn't believe that Duke Aton himself was standing before her. It was impossible. The rumors about the Duke were indeed true. His title, his money, his power, even his face, all of it bespoke greatness. He turned out to be far more impressive than she had thought. Isabella was confident that this Duke would be hers. She had no doubts about her charm, and now she had to do everything she could to win him over. Approaching the Duke, Isabella introduced herself and greeted him with a smile, confident that he would notice her. Her manner was refined and confident. However, the Duke, paying no attention to her, passed by, immediately expressing joy that Anastasia had finally arrived. He was glad to see her. Anastasia calmly and confidently replied that she couldn't ignore his invitation. She always values relationships that can be beneficial to both. Isabella was shocked to see the Duke simply ignore her. Her surprise intensified when she realized Anastasia had no claim on him. Isabella stood in amazement, unable to believe her eyes. This woman was not only unceremoniously touching her Duke, but she was not hiding it at all. Anastasia couldn't understand her relationship with the Duke. He asked her what she was doing, since at this rate, Brill's daughter might become suspicious. Anastasia decided that now was the perfect time to use the situation to her advantage. This was the moment to act decisively. She asked the Duke to play along with her in this situation. He understood her intentions perfectly, and, as if in response, kissed her, realizing it was part of their plan. Casa was also a little surprised by what was happening, but his reaction was less pronounced. The Count and Isabella, however, were completely horrified by what they saw. Can told Anastasia that he had done everything as she had asked, but it all seemed a little unnatural and even strange to everyone around him. However, Anastasia noticed that he really shouldn't have done what he did. He was lifting her up in his arms, and she thought it was time for them to go inside. The Duke suddenly cried out that this was completely different from what he had expected. He couldn't understand what it all meant or what exactly was happening at this moment. When guests arrived, he was so busy that he didn't even bother to greet them properly. His behavior seemed completely inappropriate for such an occasion. The butlers were perplexed and couldn't understand why the Duke had to receive his guests in this manner. They had expected a completely different approach. Anastasia told her father she'd had enough and it was time to leave. She was determined and had no intention of continuing this strange scene. But the Count didn't agree with her decision and immediately asked the butler who the woman was. He couldn't figure out who it could be that had so caught the Duke's attention. Jack replied that the woman was the Duke's lover. The Count was shocked, unable to believe his ears. He had never met a woman with such hair color, and the situation itself was strange. He tried to convince them that such a relationship was impossible, but Jack, the butler, said that in the Duke's family, only one heir was born from generation to generation. So Jack wished them luck, and the Count was simply shocked. He couldn't believe it was all happening this way. Isabella, holding the Count's hand, explained that this was the Duke's territory, and they must respect his rights of ownership. She then added that today's incident will remain in their memory forever, and they will never forget what happened. Casa looked at them with a smile, realizing that his mistress Anastasia was perfectly aware of the whole situation and its consequences. Once inside, Anastasia turned to the Duke and said that he could now let her go, since their conversation had come to an end. Her confusion was obvious. She couldn't understand why he'd remained silent all this time and not intervened in what was happening. Although she signed the contract, she felt ashamed of her behavior, which did not meet her expectations. Relations between them were essentially forbidden. The gentleman asked if she was planning to hide behind the contract terms. He then asked if she had achieved her goal. Anastasia didn't quite understand what he was talking about and felt embarrassed. The Duke noted that the video of her son and the intruders might have suggested something was wrong, and he thought they had angered her. Anastasia realized that she had been exposed, and she realized this the moment the Duke spoke. So, he said she could continue to do whatever she felt was right, if it would help her achieve what she wanted. All this happened because the Duke really believed that this situation was not so bad, and was ready to come to terms with it. Anastasia looked at the Duke and, with a slight smile, asked if he meant to say that he was sometimes willing to play along with her if the situation required it. She hadn't expected such an outcome, but she decided to clarify his position anyway. Can A10 calmly confirmed her assumption, making it clear that he was genuinely okay with it. However, if she was going to play this game, she needed to be much more confident in her actions. He watched her reaction closely and noticed that she was not without courage. However, Anastasia didn't immediately understand why he had suddenly decided to make such a remark. Then the Duke explained his thought. If she wanted to practice, to make their union more convincing, he was willing to play along. There was no hint of mockery in his voice, only cold determination. He spoke with such confidence that Anastasia was momentarily speechless. Her eyes widened in surprise. Was he really willing to go so far for this performance? The Duke noticed her confusion and explained that, in his opinion, the main problem lay in her reaction speed. This was precisely why their couple could appear unnatural. However, Anastasia shook her head and said that wasn't the issue at all. She suggested a different solution, holding a ball for the Toho nobility to dot the I's and cross the T's. The Duke frowned slightly, not immediately understanding what she was getting at. Then Anastasia cited Count Brill as an example, who, despite the lack of an invitation, held himself with extreme confidence. The Count not only showed up unannounced, but acted as if he had every right to do so. This could only mean one thing. He didn't hold the Duke in high regard. The Count's behavior only proved that he didn't take Can Aton seriously. Clearly, he considered himself the new Duke's equal, and perhaps even superior. If a newly elevated Duke fails to prove himself in high society, his influence will eventually begin to wane, and his position will weaken. Eventually, the Toho nobles might simply forget about his existence, meaning everyone would have the opportunity to advance their own interests at his expense. Some, like Count Brill, will try to arrange advantageous marriages by marrying their daughters to him, hoping to strengthen their family's position. And others will even begin to look at his lands, believing that the young Duke will not be able to maintain control over the north. If, however, a lavish banquet were organized and Anastasia presented as his beloved, then priorities could be set once and for all, and the Tojo nobility would respect the Duke. After this meeting, Anastasia was certain that Isabella, Count Brill's daughter, wouldn't back down so easily. She clearly wasn't one to give in without a fight, especially when it came to her ambitions. Duke Can Aton paused and wondered why Anastasia had suddenly come to this conclusion. He saw no reason why the Count's daughter would persist. Anastasia was surprised to realize that the Duke genuinely didn't understand. It had seemed obvious to her that Isabella wouldn't stop at the first failure, but this was news to him. Without going into details, the Duke simply told her to simply organize the banquet to her liking. He clearly had no intention of wasting time on such matters and gave her complete freedom. She was surprised by his reaction. However, without explaining himself, he simply calmly told her she could go, as if everything had been decided and no further discussion was necessary. His indifference upset her. He wasn't even listening to what she was saying, and that was unpleasant. He seemed completely uninterested in her opinion, and that made her think. But as she was leaving, he suddenly turned to her. His voice was calm but firm. If she wanted to accept something, she didn't need to ask his permission. These words surprised her. It seemed he trusted her more than she thought. Even though they barely knew each other, he allowed her to act independently. And yet, she found it hard to believe that such trust had already been established between them. They hadn't even really talked, let alone gotten to know each other better. So doubts nagged at her. Could she trust him as much as he seemed to trust her? Or was this simply a formality concealing something else? While Anastasia pondered this, Jack's butler could discuss with her all matters concerning the upcoming banquet. He was the one who knew how to best organize everything according to etiquette. However, Anastasia stood firm. The Duke needed to appear before the nobles in person. She believed this was an important step and had no intention of backing down. Jack looked at the Duke and said it was time to meet them. There was no point in delaying the moment any longer, even if the previous Duke had preferred to keep a low profile and not interfere in the affairs of the nobility. The decisions the nobles made were far from straightforward. However, the banquet provided an excellent opportunity to assert themselves, demonstrate their intentions, and demonstrate their strength to others. Anastasia told Can Aton practically the same thing. She wasn't just smart, but also had the ability to see deeper into situations than met the eye. However, the butler still hoped that her master wouldn't trust her too much. The Duke simply replied calmly that he believed she deserved it. If one were to thank someone for their courage, why not do it with dignity? even flowers as a token of appreciation would be quite appropriate. The butler was shocked. From the very beginning, the gentleman had acted as if he trusted this woman with complete confidence, and this greatly surprised him. That's why he signed the contract in the temple. However, the Duke himself admitted that he hadn't even intended to do so initially. It all came to pass unexpectedly. But here's the strange thing. He suddenly became interested in how it would all end. The butler wondered, what if she simply doesn't help them in the end? That was entirely possible. However, the Duke merely calmly said, so be it. After all, her will to live was incredibly strong, and that couldn't be ignored. That's why he was confident she wouldn't betray him. And if things didn't work out, that wouldn't be such a big deal either. The Lord was tired of it all. He was the strongest man in the world, a master swordsman, and everyone around him feared his mere name, Duke Khan Ayatan. Men in power often fear not enemies or intrigue, but themselves. Those bound to the ducal family by love are doomed. A curse awaits them. The woman, trembling with fear, screamed at him to stay back. A knife gleamed in her hands. Her eyes darted around, searching for a way out, but the room was locked. Her voice broke as she screamed out words of despair. If he truly loved her, he had to stop, not do this, or it would all be in vain. He didn't believe her words and asked if she understood what she was saying. Even if he let her go, she would stay with him, even after death. He grabbed her arms, shaking them, his voice breaking into a scream. Her delirious words made no sense. This was madness, and she had simply lost her mind, gone mad. A small boy watched the scene unfolding in the room. He stood silently in the shadows, clenching his fists, unable to intervene. The man screamed that her family was too pure to understand. She gave him her heart but rejected his love as if he were unworthy. He didn't understand why she didn't accept his feelings. She rejected him, calling him a monster. To her, he was a beast, not a man. A monster trying to impersonate humans. His love is a lie. He's incapable of true feelings. She called herself a saint and him an empty shell. His mother hated the ducal family, as did Khan. She suffered, dying in agony. This memory was forever etched in his mind. My father was so obsessed with my mother that, unable to bear her loss, he followed her. Without her, life lost its meaning for him. The boy who observed this concluded that love is something terrible. It destroys, leaving only pain and suffering. Grandfather told him to remember this lesson. Never forget the path that awaited him and his descendants. Fate is already sealed. There's no escaping it. Darkness surrounds their family, and no one, not he nor his children, will be able to escape it. If Anastasia helps, the consequences won't just affect her. He'll be in danger too. It's inevitable. The gentleman made another remark. Hyde had already returned. This news alarmed everyone nearby. The butler froze in shock, but Hyde had already made his way inside. He was quick, and now stood at the window behind him. The Duke asked, squinting, if there had been any progress. The boy, grinning, confidently replied that, of course, there had been. The butler, perplexed, asked why the door was needed at all. But the young man changed the subject. Anastasia has a true name. Her real name was Elvira de Arodel. The words struck like thunder, upending everything known about her. Once upon a time, she wore a crown and ruled the great empire of Arga, shaping destinies and making important decisions. Now, the past is only a memory, and she was forced into hiding. The Arga Empire has fallen, its glory vanished, and with it all who once served the throne. If this woman truly is the one, then what stands before them is not just a fugitive, but the legendary dark-haired witch. The butler asked cautiously, wanting to confirm the information was accurate. If it was indeed true, then they were facing not just a plot, but a genuine political threat. Hyde replied with a grin that this information had been hard to come by. He couldn't reveal the source, but he was confident of its veracity, as so many things matched up. The butler frowned and cautiously suggested that this woman might be a spy. Her appearance at the Duke's side could not be considered a coincidence, especially given her past. But the Duke simply dismissed these suspicions as nonsense. To him, they seemed like just another speculation, unworthy of his attention. Hyde nodded cautiously, noting that he himself didn't believe such conjectures. However, his tone betrayed doubt, for he knew how dangerous such coincidences could be. The butler irritably ordered him to shut up and not interfere with the conversation. Now was not the time for pointless arguments, especially when the Duke's safety was at stake. The Duke, unlike them, was lost in his thoughts. If this woman really was Anastasia, the former empress, then her appearance could cause a storm. The Empire would not ignore it. Enemies would only need a pretext to take advantage of the situation. Under the guise of diplomacy, they could impose their terms, take control and weaken his position. Now everything was crystal clear. But despite this, the situation began to seem increasingly interesting to him. The more complex the game, the more interesting it was to play. The Duke considered observing the capital's nobility to better understand their intrigues. His butler expressed concern, noting that if this woman were left unattended, the consequences could be unpredictable and even dangerous. Hyde watched his master closely and noted with a slight smile that he was indeed intelligent. His gaze gleamed with confidence, as if he had already thought out his next move and knew how things would unfold. After a short pause, the Duke turned to Hyde, intending to speak. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness to it, befitting a man accustomed to command and making decisions without hesitation. Jack repeated guardedly that the Duke had addressed Hyde specifically, but when everyone turned to look, Hyde was gone. The disappearance had been so swift that it seemed almost unreal. The butler, flushed with irritation and unable to restrain himself, shouted at Hyde to stop leaving the room through the window. Apparently, this strange and unacceptable method of movement within the palace walls had become a habit. Jack sighed heavily, desperately trying to figure out how many times he'd have to repeat the same request. It seemed Hyde was simply ignoring his comments, continuing to do things his own way. The Duke merely chuckled and told the butler to drop the subject. There was someone who needed to be caught, and that was far more important than complaining about Hyde and his unorthodox methods of travel. Before getting down to business, however, the Duke decided to allow himself a little rest. Jack, with a slight bow, wished him a pleasant rest, trying to hide his irritation at the situation. The Duke sighed wearily and muttered that he was tired of studying. The butler, slightly surprised by this admission, turned his gaze to the book that stood alone on the table in front of his master. When he saw the title, he was momentarily speechless. It was a relationship guide for inexperienced men, and Jack wasn't sure how to react. It was too unexpected for the Duke to read. At this point, Anastasia turned to Hyde, her voice serious. She made it clear they had something important to discuss, and her gaze brooked no argument. The young man felt deeply disappointed. He had just finished a long day of work and didn't expect to be met with such questions. Afterwards, they sat down at the table. The gentleman, studying her, asked what exactly she wanted to discuss with him as if it were important. Anastasia wasted no time, glanced at him, and said she knew his name. She was confident in her information and wasn't afraid to say so. She approached him directly because she felt he had all the answers. But she hadn't yet revealed what exactly she was interested in. At that moment, the boy became frightened. His face turned pale. He quickly began making excuses, assuring her that he wouldn't say anything even if he was tortured. He was very frightened, and Anastasia noticed it. She was surprised by how vulnerable this man seemed, despite his confident appearance. She calmly explained that she didn't want to scare him. All she wanted was to mend her relationship with Jack. She understood that her guild was under threat. There were more and more displeased glances around her, and her main fear was not what would happen to her, but that she would let the Duke down. When the guy realized what she really wanted to talk about, he relaxed. He thanked her for the coffee, thinking it could have been a pleasant moment. He said that the butler was a man of character, and the lady was surprised why he thought so, since one could always find an approach to anyone. The gentleman thanked her for the tea and added that it was time to go. He had no intention of lingering, despite the conversation still ongoing. The lady addressed him, noticing that he seemed to be planning to leave work early. Her words were gentle, but full of innuendo. Hyde replied that she had no right to dictate his time. He decided when and how much he worked. That was his own business. The lady smiled and curiously reminded him that the Duke had said she could do whatever she wanted. This offended him a little, and he didn't respond. She added that Hyde had probably been longing for a vacation for a long time, to some warm place where he could relax and forget about his worries. He came closer and asked curiously what exactly she wanted to know. His voice became a little quieter, as if she had touched on an important topic. The lady replied with restraint that it was actually quite simple. She wasn't looking for complicated answers, she just needed to understand him a little. Hyde looked at her doubtfully, insisting that nothing in the world is simple. Everything is always more complicated than it seems at first glance, especially in relationships. She agreed with him with a slight smile, noting that every person has their own weaknesses, and she would like to know what he really likes. The boy paused, pondering what was troubling him. He knew he needed to share something important, and he decided to say that it was both his weakness and his favorite hobby. It was something astonishing, and the lady was eager to find out what it was. He cautiously added that if she did hear his answer, he hoped she would truly send him on his long-awaited vacation. This decision was extremely important to him. The lady confidently replied that, of course, she always kept her promises. This was her firm position, and she had no intention of backing down from her words. This was a matter of principle for her. Anastasia, reflecting, realized that the guy might be paying for his actions. If his actions didn't live up to her expectations, she might have a hard time keeping her promise. She urged him to quickly tell her what his sweet spot was. Hyde, a little embarrassed, remarked that it had to do with his status as a duke. But Anastasia disagreed, saying that couldn't be the explanation. He finally admitted that his true desire was to go on vacation. The lady was a little annoyed, realizing that the men in this house were behaving strangely. She was irritated that she couldn't establish normal communication with them. All this caused her considerable inconvenience. That evening, Anastasia approached Kasia and asked him about what he had just said. She wanted to understand the basis for his statements and how they related to her promises. Kasia, slightly perplexed, replied that he'd heard about it from the maids. However, he couldn't be entirely sure of the veracity of this information, and so he didn't draw any final conclusions. Just behind this door is the Duke's bedroom, and in this room lives his beloved, who has been here many times and has become accustomed to this place. Apparently, she's already considered the boss here. Perhaps it's time for something serious, and they should consider getting married officially. The lady sternly told Kasia that he really had a big mouth and pressed his lips together, making it clear that some things should not be discussed out loud. She added that there were certain things employers weren't supposed to say, and he needed to understand that. Kasia remained silent, trying to process what she meant. The lady turned to him and said that since he was here, he should take care to block the door separating her space from the Duke. Kasia asked in surprise if she really wanted to put up a cabinet to create a barrier between herself and the swordmaster. He wasn't entirely sure why. The girl replied that for her, it would at least mean personal boundaries, and asked him to hurry with this so that she could feel more confident within her walls. The guy agreed to help and told her to step aside a little. With a light movement, he dragged the cabinet over without much effort. The lady also asked for a toolbox to be brought to her. She was serious, and it was clear she intended to do everything properly. Kasia, a little irritated, couldn't understand why she was doing this, but she calmly explained that she needed to fix the cabinet in its new position so that it wouldn't move. The Duke was certain it was pointless, and the lady couldn't understand why this particular room was so important to him. He'd explained it several times, but she couldn't grasp the point. Anastasia couldn't understand why the Duke was so attached to this place. She saw no point in his insistence and couldn't understand what motivated him. They always tried to maintain the appearance of a couple, but Anastasia found it difficult to hide her doubts. She was worried that the Duke was paying too much attention to her. She hoped her efforts wouldn't lead to disaster. Anastasia didn't want to become overly sensitive, as it could jeopardize their relationship. That's why she decided to hammer in the nails first, to distract herself from what was happening. This decision was driven by her desire to somehow control the situation. At that moment, she heard the Duke's voice confidently declare that he would pull out the nails even if she hammered them in. It was a strange, yet confident promise. The Duke explained that all her efforts would be in vain. He wanted her to understand that it was completely useless, and that no amount of her efforts would change the situation. Anastasia explained that her actions were aimed at her own peace of mind. Therefore, her smile was nervous, concealing her inner turmoil. He thought she was afraid she wouldn't be able to handle the tension and would snap at him at some point. This explanation confused him, but he couldn't say anything definitive. Anastasia felt a slight sense of confusion and surprise. She couldn't understand why he said it that way. She thought he was simply talking to himself. Mr. Can noticed that last time she literally showered him with compliments. But now she seemed to block his path, like a wall, creating distance between them. He didn't know what to expect from her, as her behavior always took him by surprise. At one point, he thought he was simply bothering her, creating unnecessary problems. Anastasia, sensing his gaze, explained that she simply felt uncomfortable. It had nothing to do with him, but rather with how she was feeling. He asked her with interest why she felt so uncomfortable, to which she explained that he was giving her the same powers as he did to himself, and this put her in an awkward position. Thoughts were running through her head that, in a house where debts had already exceeded reasonable limits, she didn't want to deal with this even alone, especially with a man nearby. Can Eitan took the situation too seriously, giving her not only authority but also responsibility, which she felt put too much emphasis on her actions. He agreed with her observation, but added that it shouldn't worry her, since she has the right to decide what to do in the current situation without relying on other people's opinions. He noticed that since she wasn't ignoring the situation and was still trying to work with him, it meant she genuinely cared about his well-being, which clearly didn't go unnoticed. He sincerely said that it was a good job and that he enjoyed taking care of her, expressing support and confidence that he would help her with any task that came up. Can suggested that Anastasia continue to work just as hard and not worry, assuring her that she could count on his full support in any endeavor. Anastasia, a little confused, didn't immediately understand what he was talking about. She couldn't quite grasp what exactly he meant or what he was actually offering her. The thought flashed through her head that perhaps he was going to seduce her, believing that if he was handsome and charming, he could allow himself any behavior, even such a daring one. Anastasia blushed with embarrassment when she realized where his conversation might lead. She hadn't expected such frankness. Meanwhile, Casa arrived with important news. That evening, Casa sat in a tree, reflecting. He thought about the day's events and tried to understand what was really going on in the relationship between Anastasia and Khan. Casa always thought the Duke was genuinely interested in Anastasia. He watched them interact, and his doubts gradually faded. He believed her feelings were beginning to change too. Duke Aton was increasingly captivated by Anastasia. He noticed how she paid attention to his words, even though she hadn't yet confessed her feelings. It was hard to hide. Anastasia, however, was hesitant to confess her feelings. She kept her emotions bottled up, perhaps out of fear or doubt. But deep down, she felt a growing attraction. Women who married men from the ducal family often faced difficulties. No noble titles could protect them from pressure, intrigue, and the harsh realities of life. Casa grew increasingly worried about Anastasia. He began to doubt whether she should risk entering into this relationship. He wasn't sure everything would turn out as she imagined. Suddenly, Casa noticed something strange. Jumping down from the tree, he felt the need to warn someone that now was not the time for reflection. The mood was tense, and everything was becoming dangerous. He suggested hurrying up and finishing everything as quickly as possible. Time was running out, and he knew he had to act before the situation got out of control. He was prepared for any eventuality. Casa asked with displeasure what was happening to the one keeping him waiting. His anxiety was growing, and his patience was wearing thin. He knew he had to be prepared for any answer. He added that the person who had violated his patience likely didn't understand the consequences. Casa was forthright, and his threat wasn't just empty words. He was prepared to act decisively. And then, to his surprise, a guy rolled out of the bushes. Casa raised his eyebrows, slightly surprised, but not confused. He was prepared to figure out what was going on. The boy admitted it was him, and it was clear he was uncomfortable. His embarrassment and fear were palpable. Casa assessed his condition, but he needed more information. Casa introduced himself to him and said that if he hadn't been around for a while, all that would have remained of the boy would have been horns and legs. He joked, calling him a mouse tail, and smiled. The boy, apparently a little taken aback, replied that he'd be more careful next time. He realized that the gentleman was, to some extent, dependent on him. The boy confirmed his words and handed over the bottle, adding that their guild could repay them for their help. This was their offer to Casa. Casa was a little surprised. He began to examine the bottle carefully, trying to figure out what was special about it and why this offer had been made to him of all people. The boy quickly announced that he was leaving and urged Cassia to make a decision quickly. Time was running out, and there was no time to waste. Casa, without rushing to make a choice, nevertheless asked if he was really so scary that this guy would be so persistent. This worried him. The boy, noticing that someone might overhear, warned Casa to speak more quietly as the Duke was nearby. This was an important remark. Casa wasn't particularly impressed. He continued to confidently insist that nothing would change. Meanwhile, the boy insisted that a real monster lived here. Casa was surprised to hear the boy's words about the Duke. It wasn't what he expected, and there was a note of displeasure in his voice. The boy, sensing the tension, jumped up sharply and whispered a warning to keep his voice down. Wherever the Duke was, his eyes and ears were always there. Casa removed the boy from himself and set him aside. He already knew what he needed to tell him and was ready to receive from him all the information he had in his heart. The boy was nervous and frankly said he couldn't do it, because if he told everything, the monster would probably kill him for it. Fear was visible in his eyes. Casa, without losing his composure, calmly replied that if he did not tell him everything, he would deal with him himself and force him to reveal all his secrets. The boy, recognizing the threat, began to explain that the Duke was mentally unstable and prone to paranoia. Casa had known this for a long time and wasn't interested in hearing it repeated. The boy decided that the most important news for him was precisely its revelation. But Casa merely shrugged. He already knew about it and decided the boy should leave. He decided to take a walk to calm down and clear his head. At times like these, walks always helped him refocus. Suddenly, he felt a human presence and immediately turned to see who it was. He discovered that the Duke himself was standing nearby. A strange aura emanated from the Duke, making him a little wary. Noticing him, the Duke turned to the boy, commenting on the night views. Casa was slightly embarrassed, unsure of what to say. He said that, in principle, yes, it really was a nice view for a night walk. Casa couldn't help but notice that the Duke had also decided to step outside for some fresh air. It was a rather odd, but no less interesting moment. The Duke said nothing in response. He simply stared at the boy, leaving behind a tense silence that never left his face. Casa couldn't figure out what exactly was emitting such an aura from the Duke, and felt a little disconcerted by his presence. He decided to leave. Turning around, he headed for the exit and stepped aside a little. Approaching the wall, he leaned against it, trying to relax a little after the strange encounter. He exhaled heavily, feeling his breath struggle in his chest. The Duke's proximity filled him not only with anxiety but also with a slight panic. It was hard to understand why he was breathing so hard next to him. And so, the swordmaster, who seemed always one step ahead, found himself powerless against what was happening. Anastasia, however, as always, did not lose her grip, and her lips uttered words that surprised everyone. When the Duke was nearby, Anastasia felt protected. Everything seemed fine, and that was right, because safety came first, and there was someone nearby who could guarantee it. The Duke genuinely cared about her, and she sensed it. Sometimes it was difficult to understand his feelings, but one way or another, his concern was evident, and Anastasia realized there was something she truly admired about him. That night, as Anastasia drifted off to sleep, her face tightened slightly, as if something was bothering her. It was that strange dream she couldn't forget, no matter how hard she tried. She hoped that at least today she would have a peaceful sleep, but unfortunately, reality always proved different. Instead, she found herself in the midst of disturbing images and restless thoughts. Anastasia couldn't comprehend where she was. People were standing around her, and before her was a huge hall, like a banquet hall. Everything seemed unreal, like some strange dark dream. And then, amidst the strange sounds, she began to hear echoes of something amiss. The noise grew louder, and she felt a growing sense of unease. Something was wrong, and she couldn't figure out what it was. It was too strange to be true. Anastasia didn't want to believe what was happening. Everything around her was hostile and alien, and she tried to find an explanation for this nightmare. Her mind couldn't accept the idea that this was a prophecy about the Duke's future. She couldn't believe that such a nightmare could come true, that these shadows could become reality. In this future, she felt the Duke had committed something terrible. He was capable of murder, and the thought filled Anastasia with rage. Why did she have to see such horrific images? Anastasia couldn't understand how anyone could kill a swordmaster. It seemed absurd. The swordmaster was always ready, he was merciless and invincible, and the thought of his fall was terrifying. Anastasia firmly believed that dreams never lie. This conviction was so strong that she had no doubt about their predictive power. She could not understand who among those around her was capable of such a crazy gait, which led to such strange consequences. She had put a lot of effort, emotional energy, and time into the relationship, so when something unexpected happened, she felt disappointed. At that moment, Jack, the Duke's butler, entered the room and, noticing her uneasiness, answered her question by proposing a plan for the upcoming banquet. Anastasia thanked him for his work, adding that things were moving along quite quickly and, overall, she was pleased with how things were developing. She was surprised at how quickly he was able to put together the guest list. It seemed he hadn't been in the mood to help her from the start. The butler listened silently to her comments, promising to take everything she said into account. He explained that the Duke never hosted banquets, and that was the whole reason. Now, thanks to this conversation, she understood why Jack looked so nervous and worried. A butler's ball is more than just an ordinary event. It's a chance to showcase his best qualities, his abilities, and his qualities as a servant. It's also an opportunity to highlight the status of his master, who in this case was his daughter. Organizing the perfect banquet for a butler is more than just a dream. It's a task that requires skill and attention to every detail, even the most insignificant. For the lady organizing such an event, it was a chance to find the right leverage over her servant. Anastasia turned to Jack, assuring him that this banquet would be of great significance for everyone. It was important not only for social status but also for the Duke's own reputation. She emphasized that this banquet was the debut of the new Duke Aton, and all the Tojo nobility would be watching him closely. They would rate his behavior and manner of conducting business on a scale of 1 to 10. At this moment, the Duke's fate was being decided. Either he would be accepted and bowed to, or they would attempt to co-opt him and use him for their own ends. Everything depended on how he handled this meeting. Anastasia also noted that this first banquet was an excellent opportunity to meet all the key Toho representatives. She wanted to observe how they reacted to his presence and behavior. It was crucial that none of the Toho nobles dare stand in the Duke's way. Anastasia knew that the success of the event could play a key role in establishing his position in noble society. The mistress believed this was a great opportunity for Jack. He could demonstrate his skills, his abilities as a butler, and make his master appear most worthy in everyone's eyes. Anastasia said Jack could showcase his skills and organizational abilities. This was his moment to shine and demonstrate his worthiness for his high position. Jack felt a little embarrassed by this admission. He'd always known he was capable of doing his job at a high level, but the situation still made him feel a little awkward. You need to plan everything carefully, taking into account the budget. But don't worry about money. It won't be a problem. Everything will be taken into account. The lady reminded everyone that they shouldn't forget about her guild, as it can help with the organization, ensuring everything is at the highest level. The Chaos Guild always makes dreams come true, and with its help, one can create a true celebration. The possibilities of this organization are limitless. Jack felt irritated. The witch was directly exploiting his desires and money for her own ends. This made him a little angry, and he wasn't sure of her intentions. However, for some reason, this event would be significant for him. His life would finally have something important and unusual, even though he still had doubts. Despite the fact that she had done him a favor, Jack could not believe her sincerity and continued to be wary, not believing in her good intentions. But for the Duke's sake, he was still willing to take steps forward. Casa noticed Jack had become more agitated, and this intrigued him. Casa approached the lady and asked what she had been talking about with the butler. He noticed that he was reacting to something unusual. The lady replied that nothing special had happened, but Jack, in her opinion, was in a good mood, which surprised her. The lady added that she simply gave him what he had long dreamed of, and this was the reason for the butler's mood. Anastasia planned to give Cassia a separate room. She hoped he would have already gone to the Duke's guard to sort everything out. Casa replied that he had gone to the guards but had found no one. The lady was surprised and outraged by his words. She didn't like what had happened. She couldn't understand who was protecting him now. And then Casa declared that he was capable of taking care of himself if something happened. The lady urgently demanded a meeting with the Duke, believing their tea party should end. Things were becoming too serious for a simple rest. Casa wished her a good journey, but before leaving, she asked him to follow her. He had forgotten his right to be there. The boy said he didn't understand why he should go if she had the Duke, but she insisted he go and immediately took up his duties. Casa had clearly forgotten who was paying him, and Anastasia reminded him that conscience was important in such a matter. He had to remember who was keeping him safe. She added that if Casa continues to work like this, no one will be able to protect her if something happens, and this is a very serious problem for her. Anastasia chuckled, noting that his work wasn't particularly high quality. She also asked where he was even going, since the Duke's office was right in front of them. Casa replied that he didn't understand why she was interfering in his affairs. The lady was a little angry. She clearly didn't like his behavior. Anastasia felt awkward being alone with the Duke. Her indignation was understandable. She was unaccustomed to such situations. Approaching the door, she knocked and was immediately answered. The Duke invited her in without further ado, as if he already knew she had arrived. He sat on the desk in his office, looked at her, and immediately asked what she had come to ask. His voice was calm but with a hint of interest. Anastasia began talking about the knightly battalion, and then he asked her again in surprise, not understanding what she was talking about. This left her somewhat confused. For some reason, the man began to show off everything he could. Anastasia wasn't quite sure what he was trying to convey, but it clearly wasn't part of her plan. She couldn't help but notice how his chest was catching her eye. But she quickly returned to the matter at hand, even though it distracted her slightly from the important conversation. The Duke confidently stated that he had never had knights, which surprised Anastasia. She, mildly perplexed, asked who was protecting him then. He tried to convince her that there was no need for it, that he didn't need protection. However, Anastasia insisted that the people needed to be properly arranged for the upcoming banquet. Even if security wasn't normally required, it was essential for his debut. The grounds needed to be secured, but he couldn't understand why these people were at the banquet. The lady explained that no one knew how the Tojo nobles would react, so it was wise to demonstrate force and intimidate them so that they would not dare interfere. Better safe than sorry, Anastasia believed, and she believed that such caution was justified. However, the gentleman thought about it, and the lady waited for his answer, realizing that this decision could greatly influence the further development of the situation. Anastasia understood that his thoughts were a typical gesture for someone who is under stress and trying to find the best way out of a difficult situation, but she couldn't understand why the Duke looked so depraved. This look didn't quite fit with his usual demeanor. Thoughts swirled in her head about throwing everything off her shoulders right now and doing something inappropriate with the Duke. But she quickly pushed the thought away, deciding she was going crazy. She was sure that what was happening could not be vulgar, unless this man was sent by the devil of debauchery himself, which seemed unlikely. Anastasia tried to calm down, realizing she needed to focus on the matter at hand. She needed to somehow hide her confused feelings and return to the task at hand, not to these unnatural thoughts. He approached her, noticing that she had a fever and assuming she was ill. His concern was obvious, and he touched her skin, feeling its warmth. The lady brushed his hand aside, deciding it wasn't related to the illness. She insisted everything was fine, but clearly couldn't hide her inner unease. To change the subject, she asked about the security situation, hoping that a conversation about safety would distract him and get them back on track. The Duke, having listened to Anastasia's persistent requests, agreed to place several people in the banquet hall as she requested, although he doubted the expediency of this. Anastasia said that if things continued as they were, she couldn't stay here. She was too hurt and decided to run away, escaping all these worries. The Duke was a little surprised by her decision, especially when he remembered the moment she had swatted his hand away with that look on her face. He found it difficult to understand her actions. Recalling this moment, the Duke smiled softly. He couldn't help but admit that the situation had been difficult, but perhaps that was precisely what had heightened the interest in this unusual union. It all sounded tempting. The Duke thought there might be a chance to change everything, if only he could approach the situation correctly and find the right words. As Anastasia left the room, a strange feeling arose in her soul. Everything seemed confused and unclear, as if something in her thoughts and actions were at odds. She couldn't understand what was happening to her. These feelings were unusual, and Anastasia didn't know how to cope with them, as their cause was difficult to pinpoint. Soon the day of the ball arrived, and Anastasia, despite her outward calm, secretly tried to find out as much information as possible about the events that could shock her. But despite her efforts, she was unable to obtain any vital information about the suspected murder she was attempting to investigate. Everything remained in the shadows. The wait became oppressive, as there was only one thing left to do: wait. The evening of the upcoming ball promised to be tense, and things could easily escalate into a serious quarrel between the nobles. Casa approached Anastasia and informed her that Gray had given her the dress. The maid, not without a hint of irritation, told him to give it to her personally. Anastasia wondered if Isabella would come. Casa noticed that, even though it hadn't started yet, the girl was clearly tired. It was evident in her expression. There was a heavy look on Isabella's face. Anastasia turned away and reassured her. Everything would be fine. The makeup would hide all traces of fatigue. Casa, noticing that makeup wouldn't cover everything, knew she'd have to start seriously powdering her nose to improve her overall appearance. Anastasia ordered that Casa not leave. Today he was to be with her and the Duke, as they both seemed intent on idleness. Casa didn't understand why he should be there when the Duke was there. Anastasia calmly replied that his presence at her side was his direct responsibility. Casa sighed, fatigue taking its toll. He admitted he was thirsty and asked for some water. The maid who stood nearby excitedly promised to bring water, feeling awkward about how she was attracting Casa's attention. The maid was embarrassed, because Casa was indeed very handsome, and despite her confusion, she hastened to fulfill the request. Both the Duke and Casa were not lacking in natural beauty. Casa smiled and said that the lady could now speak, turning the attention over to her. Anastasia had been very worried lately. Khan Eitan noticed her tension and decided to find out why. He expected her to tell the truth. The lady paused for a moment before admitting she had information about a possible murder. This statement left everyone perplexed. Khan Eitan was shocked and couldn't believe his ears. He asked again if someone was really dead, as the situation seemed too incredible. He thought the emperor might think she was dead, but Anastasia replied that that wasn't actually the case. There was no real threat to her, but the matter was serious. Anastasia reported that someone would try to assassinate the Duke at the gala event that day. It was a threat that could destroy everything they had built. The boy was in complete shock. He couldn't believe the situation was so dangerous and continued to think his worries were excessive. However, he was still wary. Anastasia was determined. The killer had to die today. Without waiting for further developments, She felt that otherwise her life would not be safe. However, she also wanted her faithful servant by her side. Without him, she would have a hard time dealing with this situation, and she couldn't risk it. The guy replied that he didn't know how things were with the Duke, but if she was so worried about the situation, he was ready to accompany her to ensure her safety. Anastasia shouldn't worry. She should just play her part. She understands perfectly well that worrying only gets in the way, while wrinkles are already appearing if she doesn't stop. All the nobles of northern Toho had gathered for the event. In anticipation of the celebration, all the guests were in the mood for the evening, especially since His Highness was expected to appear in the banquet hall. The Duke, noticing Anastasia's absence, asked where she was. Jack, as always, replied reservedly that the lady had conveyed that she would arrive a little later after his arrival. The butler added that Anastasia had prepared for the evening with particular care. It was her debut, and she was so eager to impress that even the butlers were a little nervous. Anastasia provided them with support through the Chaos Guild, demonstrating to everyone that she would not allow anyone to stand in the way of her beloved Duke. She certainly would not tolerate any interference. The Duke smiled, watching her actions. He was confident Anastasia would handle the role of hostess, but he couldn't help but notice. Because of her position as a mistress, Anastasia knew that she would be ignored by many nobles, because her status in society did not allow her to count on respect. Despite this, she looked forward to the moment when all these people who looked down on her would be rejected and forgotten. Duke Khan Aitan overheard several nobles discussing that this was their first banquet of this level and that they did not expect to see such splendor. However, the Duke himself was not such a simple man, and among the guests was Madame Isabella, who attracted the attention of everyone present. Today she was especially bright and confident. Her gaze shone like never before, which attracted the attention of all the men in the room. All the guests were sure that the Duke could not take his eyes off her, but soon rumors began to circulate about possible changes in the Duke's relationship with Isabella. The rumors they whispered behind her back didn't bother Isabella too much. She simply smiled and said it was all nonsense and nothing to worry about. Therefore, many had already begun to think that there was something more between the Duke and Isabella, which put them in an awkward position in front of everyone. There were rumors that the Duke never went out, never met other ladies, and everyone thought that his chosen one was Madame Isabella. Despite these rumors, Isabella always remembered his face, his beauty and refinement, and for her, this was the most important thing. His noble origins, his reputation as a swordmaster, his house full of unique and rare items, all of this was created to remain unique. Isabella was confident that her efforts would not be in vain, that she was destined to win his heart. And meanwhile, the butler announced that the Duke had arrived. Everyone felt the powerful aura that filled the entire hall. It was something inexplicable, but everyone immediately realized that before them stood a man whose fencing skills had reached unattainable heights. He was the only one in the world known as a true master of the sword. His fighting skills were unmatched, inspiring awe in even the most seasoned warriors. When the crowd saw the Duke himself, many were simply speechless. He was not only a great warrior, but also striking in appearance, reminiscent of a hero from ancient legends. Tall, with noble features and a cold yet captivating gaze, he was truly magnificent. Isabella couldn't take her eyes off him. Her heart skipped a beat. She instantly decided that this man was meant to be hers. Such a rare and worthy specimen was not to be missed, and she was determined to win his attention. But her resolve wavered when her gaze caught a glimpse of a woman with long black hair among the crowd. What was she doing here? And then the Duke extended his hand to this mysterious lady. A deathly silence fell over the room. Everyone froze, realizing that this was no mere stranger. And when she was introduced, Isabella was truly shocked. This woman was still by the Duke's side, even though, in her opinion, she should have disappeared from his life long ago. The other girls were also displeased. They immediately began questioning Isabella if she knew who this dark-haired stranger was and what her connection to the Duke was. The answer came naturally. Anastasia kissed the Duke without further ado. In that moment, everything became crystal clear. There was a much deeper relationship between them. And then the Duke himself, without hesitation, leaned down and kissed Anastasia full on the lips. A shocked silence fell over the room. No one expected such a turn of events. The men exchanged glances in utter bewilderment, completely unable to comprehend what had just happened. Their gazes darted from Anastasia to the Duke, but neither dared to say anything out loud. Anastasia felt slightly embarrassed, and, glancing at the Duke, quietly reminded him that she had asked him to avoid such actions in public. There was clear reproach in her voice, but at the same time she tried to remain calm. The atmosphere in the room grew tense, as if the air had become heavier, so Anastasia quickly grabbed his hand and, not giving him a chance to object, decisively led him away from prying eyes. She briefly mentioned that they needed some fresh air and led him toward the exit. Behind them, in the hall, the guests began to whisper, discussing her actions, and many were now convinced there was more between them than just a business relationship. Casa remained inside, listening attentively to everything the assembled group said. He was already accustomed to Anastasia and the Duke often creating such scenes to entertain the public. But this time, the conversation went further. The Count clearly intended to introduce his daughter to the Duke. This rumor hadn't surprised anyone for a long time. Many had heard of Count Brill's plans, but it seemed his efforts had been in vain. Things weren't going as he'd hoped, and those who witnessed today's scene only strengthened their suspicions. Isabella was furious. She couldn't believe that some woman would dare lay claim to her Duke. The thought of her plans being ruined made her seethe with anger, and she wasn't about to let it go. As they left the hall, Anastasia stopped and turned sharply to face him, her eyes glittering with tension. She demanded to know what exactly he had just done, and why he had done it in front of everyone. The Duke merely chuckled and calmly remarked that he should probably ask her the same question. There was no trace of remorse in his voice, only a hint of mockery. After all, she was the one who broke the terms of their agreement first. Her actions attracted too much attention, and now everything has become much more complicated than before. Anastasia was sure the Duke was talking about the prohibition of touching anyone without mutual consent. It was perfectly logical, but she hadn't expected the conversation to go that way. Of course, she knew she was at fault for not warning him in advance. She just didn't think things would go this far. Her silence wasn't received the way she'd intended. The Duke looked at her, clearly not understanding what she was talking about. His gaze betrayed genuine bewilderment, as if her words were completely illogical to him. He calmly explained that the only difference was that he'd kissed her on the lips instead of the cheek. In his opinion, it wasn't something significant enough for her to react so strongly. Apparently, he genuinely didn't realize how important this moment was for her. Besides, Anastasia didn't put up much of a fight, which clearly gave him reason to believe she wasn't against it. She asked him directly what he was hinting at. The Duke answered without hesitation. She didn't object to his touching, so it was okay with her. Her heart fluttered at his words. Is this really that feeling when you can't stop? When emotions overwhelm you and you can't control yourself anymore? The Duke admitted he'd never experienced anything like this before. His voice was firm, but his eyes betrayed an internal struggle. He seemed genuinely in love with her. Anastasia was at a loss. She thought he was simply confused about his own feelings. But there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice, and that was what made her tell him to stop lying. However, the Duke declared he intended to be even more specific. If there had been any doubts before, now he wanted to clarify everything once and for all. He confessed directly he loved her. Anastasia felt heat rise in her cheeks. These words made her uneasy, and she didn't know what to say. She had absolutely no idea what was going on in his head. How could he talk about such things so calmly when she herself hadn't yet realized her feelings? Moreover, she couldn't understand when exactly he had fallen in love with her. If that was true, then why had he agreed to sign the contract in the temple? The Duke calmly replied that he had done so only because he was following her wishes. He personally had no need to enter into this agreement, but he agreed without hesitation. Feelings are not constant. Over time, they can weaken or, conversely, strengthen. Anastasia understood this and believed that the other person should also understand that emotions are fickle. She said outright that she didn't want to take their relationship to another level. For her, it wasn't just a matter of personal comfort, but also professional ethics. She couldn't allow her feelings to interfere with her duties. Such worries merely distracted her from her work, and her tasks required her utmost concentration. As long as he remained by her side, she had nothing to worry about, for he had made a promise and would undoubtedly keep it. The Duke was completely calm. He saw no reason for doubt and was confident that he would not allow any problems. Everything was going to go as he had planned. She admitted that she couldn't know everything, but she was sure of one thing. Rumors about his origins had been circulating for a long time, and she knew what they meant. Khan Eitan had no intention of letting go of the woman who had occupied his thoughts. He was certain that no matter how the circumstances unfolded, his beloved would never disappear from his life. He was haunted by the desire to be near her, and thoughts of her never left him for a moment. This feeling he experienced in her absence was too strong to ignore. He believed it was love that made him pursue her so persistently. Anastasia thought otherwise. But perhaps that was precisely why she decided to give him a chance. If he talks about love like that, then she wants to see it in action. Mere words weren't enough. She needed proof. The Duke was surprised by her words and asked what exactly she meant. But Anastasia merely replied that he could express his feelings as much as he liked, as long as they were truly sincere. She didn't want to entertain any illusions. She needed to be sure his feelings were genuine, and not just a crush or a passing infatuation. Anastasia extended her hand to him, revealing an obsidian ring. She explained that it was a magical artifact that responded to genuine emotions, changing color depending on one's feelings for their partner. If the Duke's love was genuine, the ring would prove it. It couldn't be wrong, and now everything depended only on him. The Duke looked at the ring and asked what would happen if it did change color. What consequences would that have for both of them? Anastasia calmly replied that they would make a final decision later when the time was right. Now was not the time to rush. Everything needed to be carefully considered. If the Duke had shown up unannounced, it would have caused a lot of complications. His status obliged him to follow the rules, and a sudden intervention could have complicated the situation. But the ring he proposed to her made everything clear. It strengthened her position and made it clear to everyone around her that he wasn't just making these moves. He seemed genuinely affectionate. She couldn't help but wonder what he meant when he said those words. He said he loved her. But how true was that? Or was it just part of his plan? But she has no time to dwell on such things. She knows that love is fleeting. If she allows herself to feel it even once, the consequences could be unpredictable. She can't afford it. For her, love is something unattainable, almost a luxury. She has too much at stake, and unnecessary emotions could lead to danger. Isabella approached Anastasia and asked with a smile how she was doing. They hadn't seen each other for a long time, and by all appearances, the Count's daughter was pleased to see her. As soon as Isabella appeared, Anastasia involuntarily sighed. The girl immediately began to speak, admiring how wonderful the ball had turned out. The Duke really does seem quite perceptive. Anastasia agreed with a slight smile. Yes, he certainly doesn't miss a detail. Isabella held out a glass of wine with a smile, offering Anastasia a taste. However, Anastasia didn't even reach for it, as if sensing a trap. She didn't believe this gesture was simply a sign of politeness or a friendly treat. Isabella watched her interlocutor closely and suddenly noticed that Anastasia avoided banquets. This surprised her, and she couldn't resist asking. In response, Anastasia calmly explained that she simply had no business there, and changed the subject. Isabella, however, didn't back down. She noted that Anastasia wasn't particularly beautiful, at least compared to high society ladies. She should appear in society more often, so as not to be forgotten, and it might actually do her some good. Isabella enthusiastically continued explaining that social events aren't just about beautiful outfits, but also about pleasant conversation. For a true lady, it's crucial to maintain connections, discuss the latest news, and present yourself in the best light. Anastasia listened to these arguments but didn't attach much importance to them. She didn't care what the noble ladies thought of her. She thanked Isabella for her concern, turned away, and indifferently indicated that the conversation was over. Feeling tired, Anastasia excused herself, deciding to leave the group. Isabella, on the other hand, was irritated by her behavior. She wasn't used to such indifference and clearly expected a different reaction. Anger boiled within her. But Isabella wasn't about to back down. She believed that sooner or later the truth would emerge, and then everyone would know who Anastasia really was. For now, all she could do was wait for the right moment to reveal her true face. When Isabella looked at Anastasia again, she was already holding a glass of wine. However, instead of taking even a sip, she calmly tilted her hand and poured the contents onto the floor. The gesture seemed like a challenge. Looking at the spilled wine, Anastasia realized Isabella had gone too far. She was even prepared to use poison to achieve her goal. Such a move meant her rival was prepared to take any measure and was unafraid of the consequences. A faint, barely perceptible odor emanated from the glass. It was poison, but not lethal. Most likely, it was intended to deprive a person of common sense, making them vulnerable and pliable. Such a weapon worked unnoticed. Isabella's goal was obviously to make Anastasia behave erratically under the influence of the poison. It was a classic aristocratic ploy, to disgrace a rival so that everyone could see her fall. But the plan didn't work. Anastasia wasn't surprised. If she'd been an ordinary girl, she might have downed the offered drink without a second thought. But her past experience didn't allow her to be so careless. In the past, she was the emperor's wife, surrounded by intrigue, betrayal, and danger in every glass of wine. Compared to those times, death by poison seemed the easiest fate. Isabella looked pleased at this point. She suggested the girls relax and spend the evening in pleasant company, as if nothing unusual had happened. However, despite her expectations, Anastasia felt no change in her condition. She expected a trick, but nothing happened, and this even surprised her. If the drink really did contain poison, it should have taken effect by now. However, Anastasia didn't feel the slightest discomfort. This was strange and raised even more questions. Isabella generally tried to appear friendly and welcoming, but now, during the ball, she didn't even try to hide her intentions, as if she had nothing to fear. She didn't even pretend she hadn't added anything to the drink. It seems she didn't care whether Anastasia figured it out or not. That was even more suspicious. The living room was filled with a pleasant, slightly spicy aroma. It was calm, and the atmosphere didn't hint at danger, but something still kept Anastasia from relaxing. The scent seemed worthy of a duke, noble and profound. However, Anastasia couldn't imagine it being suitable for a man like Can Atan. Isabella noticed something unusual about the scent. She said it had an animalistic odor, as if something wild were nearby. The other girls also smelled this strange odor. Someone even covered their noses because it was so pungent and thick. Where could it have come from? Although the aroma was overwhelming, everyone felt a sense of curiosity. Where was its source? Isabella glanced quickly at Anastasia, awaiting her reaction. Clearly, someone was deliberately concealing their true nature. If the Duke himself hadn't come out to them, it meant he didn't want his presence revealed. Anastasia understood he wasn't so simple. Wherever I go, there are such creatures, she thought. She felt sorry that they themselves did not realize their fate. The only way to preserve honor and pride was to disappear. But before Isabella could take a single step back, Anastasia approached her, preventing her from retreating. Anastasia calmly but firmly stated that they were talking about her now. She left no room for doubt, pointing directly at the girl. Isabella turned around sharply, clearly indignant. She began to justify herself, insisting it wasn't her fault. But Anastasia did not give her time for long explanations and demanded an answer. Isabella, unabashed in her contempt, hurled insulting words at Anastasia, calling her a dirty girl, as if she'd once wandered through back alleys. Her voice was harsh, clearly implying that she considered her unworthy of being there. The girls around them watched the proceedings with undisguised delight, as if they were witnessing a captivating performance. They found it amusing that some simpleton had suddenly found herself among the aristocracy and was now acting as if she knew everything and everyone there. Isabella spoke with undisguised contempt about Anastasia's pretense of being a housewife, but in reality, her position was worthless. The daughter of a ruined family could expect nothing more than the role of a court mistress. She didn't believe someone like Anastasia could become a duchess. It was obvious to her that a mere rag would remain a rag, no matter how hard she tried to pass herself off as something more. Anastasia simply smiled calmly, not letting her emotions get the better of her. Then, tilting her head, she calmly noticed that Isabella was currently holding a rag in her mouth. Isabella might have seemed like a sweet girl from the outside, but once you heard her speak, it became clear how full of malice and contempt her words were. The way she spoke was simply disgusting. Isabella leaped from her seat, seething with rage. She couldn't believe that this pathetic girl, descended from a baron's family, dared to look at her with such defiant arrogance. In anger, she swung her arm, intending to hit Anastasia. But before her palm could reach its target, Anastasia grabbed her hand and squeezed it tightly, making it clear who was stronger. Her voice was low and menacing. She warned that she was holding back with all her might from doing something far more drastic. Her words sounded as if she was seriously prepared to rip out her opponent's tongue. Isabella recoiled, her eyes wide with fear. She couldn't understand how Anastasia, this insignificant upstart, could dare speak to her in such a tone and threaten her so openly. But Anastasia didn't pursue the conflict further. She suggested forgetting the incident, just as one might forget the contents of a glass spilled on the tablecloth. It wasn't worth the trouble. However, she made it clear that if Isabella did not change her behavior, the consequences for her next time would be much worse. Isabella, trying to maintain a shred of dignity, smiled and asked if Anastasia really thought she could insult the Count's daughter with impunity. She was certain her rival would regret such words. Someday, Isabella will anger her so much that Anastasia will gouge out her eyes and break her fingers. Such a decision won't be random, but carefully thought out. After that, she'll throw her out to be fed to the beasts. Isabella won't be strong enough to survive in this world, and Anastasia will be glad of that. But if Isabella decides to doubt her strength, then she should prepare for the worst. Anastasia won't wait. She'll destroy her herself, period. Anastasia hoped the girl would understand her hint. She was sure her words would calm her down for a while, as she was too concerned about her reputation. This really infuriates Anastasia, as she's used to having her decisions unchallenged. This is clearly not a time to show weakness. The lady suddenly asked what Casa was doing here, in this place, and why he had even appeared beside her. There was a note of caution in her voice. Casa noted with a grin that he himself had heard the lady order him to stay with the Duke, though it seemed he didn't need anyone. He had come anyway, worried. The lady replied that she was perfectly capable of dealing with the whims of this infant. After all, she was not just a high-ranking official, but an empress, and it was her duty. Casa noted that she could probably handle one or two problems, but she should not forget that her academic years were connected with defense and protection. The woman said she found it hard to understand why the boy was so worried, and he replied that he was worried because he feared for her safety. He couldn't come to terms with it. She replied that there was no need to worry, since his job was to protect her. She tried to persuade him to calm down and asked him not to argue, but to follow her. In any case, she didn't want to continue making jokes like that. She didn't understand why he couldn't understand what she meant. It upset her, but she kept silent. If the Duke is exposed to the paralyzing poison, he will lose control of his thoughts and actions. He will be helpless. The Duke decided to take advantage of the situation. He understood it was a chance to learn important information that could be useful in the future. Everything depended on how he acted. At that moment, his daughter approached him, and he immediately asked her what had happened. He was concerned, unsure of what was going on in her life or why she had come. She was a little confused, but quickly began to say that she wanted to go home. Isabella couldn't stand Anastasia any longer. Her presence irritated her. Her father was surprised that she decided to return so quickly, but he agreed anyway. He didn't try to persuade her otherwise, believing it was her personal choice. He said he needed to speak with the Duke before returning home. Isabella insisted that her father not linger and end the conversation quickly. The girl didn't want to stay in this place another minute. Her patience had run out and she was ready to leave, but then she noticed her father looked puzzled. The father couldn't figure out where the glass of poison, which had just been on the table, had gone. He looked around but couldn't find it, which alarmed him. Isabella stood nearby, and perhaps it was she who took the glass. It couldn't have been a coincidence, and her gaze haunted him. Duke Khan Aitan approached his daughter, Isabella, his face full of worry. He was visibly nervous, his gaze darting around the room. The situation troubled him. He handed the glass of wine intended for the Duke, but the Duke didn't notice where he placed it. For a few seconds, he tried to figure out what to do next. Duke Khan Aitan noticed something unusual about Anastasia that evening. Her behavior seemed odd and her gaze was unfocused. He couldn't understand what exactly was keeping her from being calm, why she kept looking around as if searching for something, and his presence didn't calm her down. Anastasia, sensing his gaze, said a little nervously that she simply felt awkward dancing with him. She'd already taken an etiquette course, but she still felt out of place. Deep down, Anastasia felt she needed to find out where this killer was as soon as possible. After all, not only lives, but also her reputation were at stake. But at that moment, the Duke approached her and, looking into her eyes, told her not to worry about anything but him. He was certain that all her problems would disappear if she trusted him. Anastasia sighed, but still thought it would be nice to pretend, at least for a moment, that his words were reaching her. But she still didn't understand why she needed to. The Duke, noticing her displeasure, gently ordered her to bend down. He was sure this behavior would help her concentrate, and perhaps she would begin to trust him more. Anastasia and Khan Aitan turned their attention to Isabella, who suddenly attempted to strike Anastasia. However, her blow missed. Isabella's missed strike accidentally hit herself. She took a few steps back and felt a slight sting from the blow. Anastasia was surprised to see Lady Isabella. She remarked that she should be more careful in her actions, especially in situations like these. She hadn't expected Isabella to be willing to go so far. This truly surprised Anastasia, who had been certain of something else. Anastasia couldn't understand how Isabella could dare to do such a thing. Forgetting all sense of propriety, she simply walked up to her and slapped her across the face. Perhaps Isabella was the killer, but Anastasia couldn't be sure. Too many questions remained unanswered. However, in reality, it was unlikely to have been her. After all, Lady Isabella was apparently opposed to Anastasia, not the Duke. At that moment, Isabella grabbed Anastasia by the skirt, her face distorted with rage, and her mouth full of insults and dirty words addressed to her rival. Casa immediately ran to Anastasia, his face filled with worry and anxiety. He didn't know what to do, but he was ready to protect her at any cost. At that moment, shards of glass flew around, and Anastasia was stunned by what was happening. Her reaction was a mixture of surprise and alarm. When Anastasia opened her eyes, her gaze immediately fell on the Duke, who, like a protector, covered her with his body, shielding her from the dangerous fragments. Despite several wounds, the Duke wasn't worried about himself. His primary concern was whether Anastasia had been harmed. She tried to reassure him, suggesting he focus on himself and his wounds. But he simply waved her off, not wanting her to worry about him. Meanwhile, she noticed his ring begin to glow bright red. It reminded her that his care for her ran much deeper than she thought. Anastasia couldn't understand why he'd done it. With his mastery of dodging, he could have easily avoided harm. Why, then, had he taken the risk? But the Duke explained that if he had dodged the blow, she would certainly have been hurt. It was his duty to protect her, even at the cost of his own health. Anastasia countered that the Duke was bleeding and needed help. She was ready to act immediately, ignoring his words. She ordered that anchors be brought in and that the wounds be treated immediately. But the Duke again tried to calm her, insisting that there was nothing to worry about. The lady was outraged and couldn't understand how he could speak so calmly when his body was literally covered in blood. How could anyone not be worried in such a situation? He reassured her with a smile, saying there was no need to worry. He was a master swordsman, and such wounds were no threat to him. Everything would be fine. Anastasia, although she didn't entirely agree with his opinion, nevertheless decided to listen to him. He was clearly confident he could handle this on his own. The Duke confirmed there was no need to worry. At that moment, a servant approached them, apparently wanting to know what to do with the woman who was nearby. The servant, awaiting instructions, inquired what they should do with the woman, who probably represented some danger or importance to the situation. The servants managed to grab Isabella, and in this situation she still could not stop herself from mocking Anastasia, calling her names. Anastasia was shocked by the situation, not understanding how Isabella could continue her curses despite everything that was happening. Isabella kept screaming that Anastasia must die. This forced Anastasia to ask the Duke for permission to deal with her. The Duke agreed to her request, and she immediately asked the servants to release Isabella, giving her a chance for one last meeting. Anastasia also asked for a sword so that she could protect herself if necessary or act if the situation gets out of control. She decided to give Isabella one chance by asking her if she thought Anastasia, the Duke's mistress, really deserved to die. Anastasia warned that this was Isabella's last chance, and everything she said would be decisive for her future. If Isabella decides that Anastasia must die, she can take up the sword and try to finish what she started. Anastasia noticed that Isabella seemed eager to take her place. She sensed that the girl was counting on replacing her. And if she thinks she deserves it, then she should probably be ready to fight for it, because there is no place for the weak here. This made Anastasia very angry, because the young ladies not only insulted her, but also tried to humiliate her, which was completely unacceptable for her. It was especially unpleasant that the ball, which she had worked so hard to organize, was ruined by all these stupid incidents. Although, in fact, she was already ready to ignore it, she could not forgive the fact that Isabella dared to harm the Duke. Anastasia didn't understand how she had ended up in this situation, but when Isabella shouted at her not to act like a savage, it angered her. She couldn't understand why she should be the one to behave with restraint, since ladies weren't supposed to fight with swords, and she didn't agree with that. Anastasia couldn't understand at what point she began to care about the situation with the Duke, because before she hadn't thought about it at all. Then she cut off a couple of strands of Isabella's hair, not expecting that it would lead to such strong irritation on her part. Frankly, if it weren't for her restraint, she could have cut off not only Isabella's hair, but something more serious. At that moment, she didn't even immediately realize that she was close to simply removing her dagger in a fit of anger. But it's interesting that as soon as it comes to approaching from behind, Isabella becomes bold and daring, but she is afraid to fight on equal terms. Anastasia added a little poison to Isabella's glass, turning the other ladies against her in order to increase her influence and convince everyone that her decision was the only correct one. Isabella, however, lacked the courage to raise her sword, and it didn't seem to bother her at all. Her pride wouldn't allow her to admit she was the weaker one in this fight. Anastasia noticed her helplessness, and it irritated her. She was so confident that she began yelling at her without holding back. Anastasia believed that such an insignificant girl as Isabella had no chance of taking a place at the Duke's side. She was confident the Duke wouldn't throw her out. Suddenly, Anastasia thrust the knife sharply in front of Isabella, declaring that she would only say it once. This was intended to arouse both fear and respect in her. She stated outright that Can van Eyten was her man, and no one dared question her right to him, even if someone tried to interfere. Anastasia added that if anyone else dared to stand in her way, the consequences would be dire. Her gaze was full of determination. Duke Khan, standing to the side, watched the proceedings with a smile on his face. He was amused by how easily Anastasia controlled the situation. Finally, Anastasia thought that perhaps Isabella had finally realized her mistake. She hoped the girl would understand the full consequences of her behavior. As Isabella started to leave, she suddenly grabbed the sword and threw it towards Anastasia, as if by accident, but clearly with the intention of showing something. Anastasia was in complete shock. She quickly turned around, and at that moment she heard a strange sound that made her feel like something had happened. Turning, she saw the sword pierce Isabella's shoulder. The whole scene was terrifying and unexpected, but the moment proved fatal for the girl. At that moment, everyone realized that this was the Duke's act, trying to protect Anastasia, acting instinctively but with extreme determination. Isabella began to scream, begging the Duke not to do it, but her words had no power when the Duke continued to stand with such a determined look. He answered her in a cold tone that he was very sorry, but he had not managed to kill her with the first blow, which indicated his intentions. The whole situation was simply absurd. The Duke didn't hesitate and dealt with Isabella with astonishing speed, showing no emotion. Isabella couldn't believe that the Duke, with whom she had been in contact for so long, had treated her so cruelly. She was completely hysterical. In desperation, she began to beg the Duke to spare her. She begged him on her knees to let her go, realizing the situation had become critical. She begged for mercy, but the Duke remained unmoved and raised his weapon, preparing to deliver the finishing blow. However, Anastasia intervened. Anastasia, seeing what was happening, said she had had enough. She asked the Duke to stop, not to escalate the situation. Chaos reigned in the hall. The nobles were shocked and panicked, unable to understand how everything could have gotten so out of control so quickly. Anastasia stood watching, unsure what to do. The Duke, covered in blood, continued to stand there, showing no sign of agitation. Everything that was happening reminded her of a scene from a dream she had recently had. She realized it wasn't just a dream, but a premonition of what was to come. The gentleman intervened and expressed his displeasure, calling the Toho nobles' behavior a true disgrace. They couldn't possibly have greeted Lord Aten himself like that. The gentleman turned out to be Count Thor von Guardian. The northern lands clearly didn't appeal to the locals, and many were surprised that this particular duke had been singled out. He noted that this was all just part of an unnecessary show, and that, of course, it shouldn't have been done that way, and it wasn't done without reason. The Duke himself was involved in this matter, and one of the noble women from the central lands decided to act in this manner. She clearly didn't understand the consequences. And now, like another blow, all this was happening right before the Duke's face. For a northern nobleman like him, it was especially humiliating. It was impossible to simply ignore such manipulations from the central lands. A response was required, a demonstration of strength and resilience. He could have remembered that he was always ready to become the Duke's sword if he so desired. His support was not empty words. As soon as the northern gentleman returned, he immediately congratulated him on this event. He was glad to be back in his native land, ready for new challenges. Another lady, noticing his return, greeted the Master of the North. People began to gather, also expressing their respect and admiration. Congratulations on the Duke's arrival began to pour in, and Anastasia couldn't hide her joy. It all seemed as if she, too, had received recognition. At some point, absorbed in what was happening, he suddenly remembered the ring. Its color had changed, and this was significant, although at first glance it might have gone unnoticed. Now, it was the mistress's turn. He eagerly awaited this moment, knowing that everything would soon change and events would unfold rapidly. His heart, which had been calm before, now suddenly began to beat faster. He felt the tension surge, causing his heart to beat twice as fast. Duke Dukan was too greedy. He had long since begun to show an interest in imperial affairs, and apparently his grandfather held an important political position. The entire royal family and nobility looked up to Dukan alone. His influence was so strong that they couldn't take any action without his approval. It was difficult to understand why Count Brill had been sent to spy on the Duke. The decision seemed strange and ill-founded, but such was the will of higher powers. What he planned to do with Duke Brill also remained a mystery. He seemed too old and wise for such games, and his actions were beginning to seem absurd. Duke Dukan most likely believed that this way he could test his strength by pushing others to action, forcing them to react to his steps. That's why he sent someone he considered unimportant to extract hidden information about the Duke. He was willing to take risks regardless of the consequences. This situation could be an opportunity to sway the North toward unity, He hoped that other dukes and nobles would understand how important solidarity was for the future of the empire. Having found himself in this game, Duke Dukan clearly had his sights set on his goal, since he allowed himself to treat Duke Aiton with such disrespect. Draft noticed how they were openly provoking Aiton, trying to get him angry. Something had to be done immediately, but Aiton hated politics. The Count then said he couldn't simply ignore what was happening, pretending nothing had happened. He needed to go to the capital and sort things out. The Count also noted that he didn't seem to understand how strongly the North opposed the center. In these lands, they had fought for centuries for their freedom and land. The land in the North is not as fertile and prosperous as the capital. However, Northerners are proud of their homeland and their independence, despite the difficulties. In the center, Northerners are seen as mercenaries helping to guard a vital border. They are considered essential to ensuring security. Despite this, they don't refuse their military and financial assistance. Such allies are necessary, but relations with them remain complicated. For this reason, the center is deliberately imposing high taxes on Northerners. They must pay for their role in protecting the borders and maintaining order. After the war, the population in the North declines significantly. This worsens the situation as the population dwindles. Nobles from Toho began marrying women from the Central Territories. These marriages were intended to strengthen ties and transfer power to the North in the future. Through such alliances, the Central region's influence in the North grows ever stronger. This is a strategic decision that will bear fruit over time. Duke Khan Aitan noted that Dukan proved to be a truly intelligent and far-sighted man. His strategies repeatedly surprised. Then, after some reflection, the Count mentioned that his mistress could become a symbol of northern feminine power. She's not just a beautiful woman, but an example for others. Her will and spirit were complex, and in this he saw true strength. Therefore, the Count thought it would be wise to marry her to emphasize her importance. The Duke noticed that the conversation had strayed slightly from the point and suggested focusing only on the important and relevant issues. He wanted everything to be to the point. Kraft, unable to bear the pause, decided to ask where the Duke was headed. He was curious about his plans. To this, the Duke calmly replied that his target was Anastasia. He felt he needed to speak with her about something important. Hearing this, the Count was surprised that someone in such a state would go to see a woman and suggested that the Duke at least wash himself before the meeting. However, the Duke dismissed his remarks, declaring them none of the Count's business. The Count was shocked by such disdain. The Duke also expressed curiosity about whether the woman had survived. The Count confirmed that she had, and the Duke merely recalled how he had chopped off her hand. Ken ordered her placed in a coffin and sent back. He was confident that Dukan would understand. He was no fool, and the situation would raise no questions. At this time, the Duke was taking a bath. Lost in thought, he called Anastasia to his room to discuss an important matter. When Anastasia entered, she asked in surprise if it wasn't strange that he was taking a bath at a time when they should have been discussing business. The Duke calmly replied that everything was fine and she could leave without worrying. He was confident that nothing unusual was happening. He noted that such actions might be uncomfortable for her, but Anastasia merely said that she had brought him some ointment to relieve the discomfort. The Duke replied that the ointment would certainly help, but the wounds would heal on their own. He wasn't particularly concerned about their condition. Anastasia believed the ointment would speed up healing. Then he suggested that she apply it as he trusted her skills, but she disagreed. She said she didn't see the point, especially in the bathroom. She thought he could handle it himself. The Duke reminded her that he had protected her and dealt with the woman. Seeing her hesitation, he insisted, and Anastasia agreed to help. She took the ointment and asked where exactly he was hurt, ready to help him with his wounds despite her doubts. The Duke enthusiastically began to show the places where he was injured, and first of all he pointed to his face, showing a small scratch. Anastasia asked him to sit still, as she was focused on his wound and wanted to do everything carefully. As she began to carefully apply the ointment to the wound, their gazes met and a moment of indescribable tension passed between them. The Duke, a little embarrassed, asked her if she thought it was unnecessary, and a little unnecessary. Anastasia, thinking he was referring to the lady they'd just been talking about, replied that the woman had definitely gotten what she deserved. The Duke asked why the lady hadn't killed her, since even though he'd forgotten what he'd done wrong, it was just a childish misbehavior. He was testing her reaction. Anastasia replied that there was no point in killing for her. Even if she had wanted to, it wouldn't have brought her anything. Sometimes, of course, she would have liked to do so, but deep down she knew she wouldn't. It would have been too radical for her. The Duke noticed that there were many dead on the battlefield, and those people were just like her, so it wasn't all that unexpected. The lady did not immediately understand what he was getting at, and he explained that the enemy has no gender, and one's actions can always be justified. For him, killing was nothing more than a necessity for survival in a cruel world where weakness could not be allowed. As a child, no one looked after him, so he learned to cope with difficulties on his own, without expecting help from others. The lady thought he was probably making excuses and trying to convince her that she didn't understand the reasons for his actions. She found this a little endearing. The Duke was sure there was nothing unusual in his actions and couldn't understand why she was laughing. Anastasia said it was simply astonishing. She admitted that it was not a surprise, although it seemed strange, because, in the end, he turned out to be completely different from what she expected. The Duke was slightly stunned. He knew, of course, that she saw him differently, but now he wanted to capture her attention even more. The Duke caught Anastasia's attention from the very first glance. Every smile he gave her made her blush, despite her attempts to maintain composure. However, he was in no hurry. He knew she would eventually be his, and there was no need to rush. He was confident of his success. He was patient and willing to wait. He knew that sooner or later Anastasia would be his, and it was only a matter of time. One day, Anastasia confessed to him that all this might seem strange, but she felt that there was something more to their relationship. She was surprised to discover that he wasn't so perfect either. He didn't have that special something she'd expected. No one could understand why she had such a strong reaction to him in particular. It was something new and unusual. At one point, he suddenly grabbed her hand and dragged her into his bathroom. Anastasia was shocked by this turn of events. She couldn't understand what he was like, what kind of crazy behavior he was allowing himself to do. She asked him what was going on. He gently brought his face close to hers and said that he couldn't hold back any longer. The desire was too strong. He asked her to sleep with him, promising to be gentle and caring. His words sounded confident, but Anastasia didn't know how to react. Anastasia, in turn, was surprised by his frankness and asked him why he always said such indecent things. The Duke replied that she shouldn't bother with formalities. He believed they were unnecessary and that all of it was just unnecessary words. He assured her that she felt the same way he did. This wasn't just a business relationship, there was something more between them. He tried to explain that their relationship was already going beyond official duties, and that this feeling could not be ignored. Anastasia tried to understand what she was really feeling. Her inner experiences were becoming increasingly confused. He hoped she wasn't actually opposed to his proposals. All he needed was some assurance of her feelings. He hoped that she would not find his behavior offensive and that she would be able to accept him for who he was. Perhaps from their very first date, Anastasia began to have some feelings for the Duke, although she did not realize it at first. However, there was no room for love in her life. Every day was full of struggle, and she didn't allow herself to think about feelings. She was an illegitimate child, used and abandoned, and her mother was beheaded by her husband. This left deep scars on her. Anastasia has survived so many hardships that she has become strong and resilient. She has spent her entire life fighting for survival, not allowing herself to show weakness. Because of the constant threat to her life, she can't be a normal girl. Many reasons force her to stay away from him, but something about him captivated her. She could no longer deny her feelings, which grew stronger with each passing day. She admitted that he was right, and admitted to herself that she was drawn to him, despite all her internal barriers. Unable to contain herself any longer, she kissed him. He was too handsome, and if it was just for one night, she didn't care. She wanted it. She wanted to have him completely, including his thoughts and desires, in order to be close to him at least a little. But as soon as her thoughts returned to the beginning of their meeting, she felt embarrassed and hesitant. She asked him for a moment to compose herself. The Duke didn't understand her strange behavior and thought it was too cruel to end things at such a moment. She explained that that was not the case and invited him to go to her bedroom. The gentleman, of course, couldn't refuse her request and readily picked Anastasia up. He gently carried her to the bedroom, holding her carefully in his arms. He pulled off her wet dress, his fingers sliding over the fabric. He couldn't even imagine that Anastasia would one day be on his bed. It was like some kind of dream. He'd never imagined they'd be this close before. But now he was next to her, and it was perhaps the most amazing moment of his life. He wanted her to look him straight in the eye, so there would be no distance between them. He hoped she would feel what he felt and not be distracted. He hoped her thoughts would be occupied only with him and nothing else, so that she could fully absorb his attention and understand how important this moment was to him. He wanted her to think only about him and what was happening between them. for her feelings to be pure and real. Everything else didn't matter at that moment. They continued kissing, and suddenly, like a bolt from the blue, she stood up. He couldn't understand what was happening. Everything had seemed so natural, but now the situation had changed. He noticed they were in the middle of it when she suddenly stood up. He felt himself getting hot. It was hard to understand, but he tried to focus on her. He continued to do everything he could to make things right. He was confident that he had to do things her way, and he hoped she would be pleased with his efforts. She asked him not to move, but to continue kissing her as before. She was at that point where his every touch was important to her, and she didn't want him to stop. The Duke himself hadn't known that kisses from his beloved woman could be so delightful. He felt so alive that he couldn't stop savoring the moment. But suddenly, without warning, he began to rise. He didn't know what exactly made him do it, but she was afraid, and he sensed her anxiety. He froze. She told him to stay put and not move, but he disobeyed, and a question arose in his heart. Was he doing the right thing by following her request? She told him he shouldn't do anything until they were sure of their actions. But he couldn't understand why he wanted to continue and not stop there. But that wasn't enough. He wanted more. He was sure he wouldn't just stop, but he also didn't know if he had the strength for more. He asked her to take it easy because he truly couldn't control himself at that moment. His emotions were spiraling out of control, and it was too much for him. The lady was embarrassed and felt her body weaken. She saw his persistence reflected in his eyes, and she knew she couldn't continue. Nothing is stronger than me, he thought, leaving his marks on her body. His desire didn't fade, but rather grew stronger and more obsessive. It was madness. The lady liked it, and despite her inner struggle, she couldn't help but give in. It seemed she had broken his defenses, and now he couldn't hold back. After a while, they were almost finished, but she, exhausted, said she couldn't take it anymore. Tired, she felt her strength ebbing away. But the Duke disagreed with her words and said the night had only just begun. She had to understand that, otherwise she wouldn't see the full extent of what he intended to do. She couldn't understand why he was saying this, but he laid her back down on the bed, continuing to insist on his way. She felt her resistance melt away. She asked him to wait, but he ignored her pleas. The night wore on, and his desire was stronger than her words, stronger than her doubts. Sometime after the Duke's death, in a place accessible only to him, he found his grandfather's old diary. It was the place where his most hidden thoughts were kept. As his death approached, his magical power gradually weakened. In this process, he began to see Khan Eitan not simply as a successor, but as something greater, something more significant. He began to realize that this young man was his true grandson. And with each passing day, this understanding of this connection grew deeper and more meaningful to him. It was then that he realized his son had died, never having found happiness, along with his beloved. And now his grandson had inherited not only magic, but also deep trauma. The boy, oddly enough, didn't even understand human emotions. It seemed as if the whole world was empty and alien to him. He didn't know how to process these feelings. Watching him, his grandfather felt a heavy burden of guilt. He felt he could have done more to raise him and heal his inner pain, but it was too late. Although his grandfather escaped the curse, he was right to save his marriage. Despite this, he never experienced true love in his life. The Duke seemed content with his life. He closed the diary, keeping its pages hidden from everyone. Perhaps this was his way of letting go of the past. Previously, he had two choices. To avoid going mad from the curse, he was forced to suppress his emotions, pretending nothing was happening. From childhood, he'd been taught to restrain himself, to keep his emotions under wraps. It was the only way to survive. He hoped he could withstand this ordeal. He said he didn't want to live like his grandfather. His first decision was to suppress his emotions and live like him, so as not to lose control. The second path was dark, like his father's, to go mad and disappear without a trace. It wasn't what he wanted, but he knew no other way out. If he didn't learn to control his emotions, the same fate awaited him as his father. He didn't want to become a copy of what had come before. He decided to refuse his grandfather's offer. Even if his life was short, he wanted to feel alive, not like a walking dead man. He wanted to feel alive, especially when his beloved woman was nearby. In her presence, something changed within him. He felt real. Of course he wanted to preserve this moment, not lose it. He tried to savor everything he could, but fear sometimes clouded his mind, preventing him from relaxing. But he doubted he could trust this girl. He had always been wary of everyone, and now his feelings were even more confused. He didn't know if she was someone he could confide in. His attitude was cautious, and he didn't know what to do with this feeling. Suddenly, he saw himself as small. He thought that perhaps by offering trust he was taking a risk, relying on luck rather than reason. He thought that perhaps the guy simply didn't like her, that her affection wasn't genuine. This left him feeling unsure. But the boy, at his young age, said he didn't know. But he wondered if his older self was afraid of this, of that same uncertainty. The Duke smiled, assuring him that he had nothing to fear. He seemed perfectly calm, as if nothing could disturb him at that moment. The boy, however, didn't share his confidence. He pointed into the distance where his father stood and declared that he would end his life just like him. He said that her life would likely end like his father's if she continued to follow him. This was his vision of the future. The guy continued that in such a situation, it would be best to seal him. Otherwise, he would not be able to find peace and would continue to suffer. This will give him a chance to live a normal life, without fear and pain, without unnecessary worries about what might happen to this person. The Duke, hearing these words, asked again if the boy really thought that it was so easy to give up everything that surrounded them. The young man was struck by the Duke's apparent lack of concern for the woman's life. It struck him as strange and unnatural, as if he didn't notice the importance of her fate. The Duke replied that his life and feelings should not concern the boy, and the fact that he was worried about Anastasia's fate did not matter at all in this situation. The boy said with determination that the Duke was lying. He was convinced that the woman shared his mother's fate, and that was the only reason for his concern. He was sure that if Anastasia learned his secret, she might reject him. This made him worry about her future. But the Duke was certain that Anastasia would be different. He was convinced that she was unlike other people, and her fate would not be the same. He continued to insist that all people were the same, but Anastasia, in his opinion, was special. She was different from everyone else, and that changed everything. The boy, however, thought that perhaps he was simply in love with her. This explained his actions, and he couldn't find any other answer. The Duke, smiling, confirmed his thoughts. The boy, however, fell silent, embarrassed, because even he himself didn't know what true love was. He couldn't understand how anyone could be so certain of feeling something they hadn't experienced before. It seemed as if the emotions he was experiencing were completely new to him. The Duke asked again if he really couldn't hear, like he couldn't understand what they were saying to him, trying to figure out what was happening. As the Duke embraced her, his heart began to beat so hard it felt like it was about to burst out of his chest. He felt that this was something special, something that could not be ignored. He thought it was love, but the guy advised him not to try to copy other people's behavior, not to look for meaning in what they were experiencing. He too was ready to go mad and die, like all those who had gone before him. However, the Duke nodded and said that if this was his fate, she was ready to accept it. He was prepared to do this rather than leave Anastasia. He couldn't give her up, even if it meant going against his will. The boy was silent for a moment and then quietly said that she was saving him, and therefore, perhaps, she was destined to die. The Duke flew into a rage, demanding the boy leave and never return. He wouldn't hear a word, considering it all absurd. He didn't need saving, because he had already received everything he needed. And now he wanted to understand what was behind what was happening between them. What was happening between them was something strange and mysterious. He felt a desire to understand what kind of feeling they were experiencing. The Duke turned to Anastasia and said his curiosity was now satisfied. But he still wasn't sure hers was equally curious. He couldn't be sure of her feelings, so he simply hugged her while she slept, unable to get rid of his doubts and questions. Jack was in shock, screaming that they would never have another chance like this. All the butler's hopes were shattered, and he felt like all was lost. This lady was ruining all his dreams, and he was furious with the Duke. If it weren't for him, he would have taken her head himself without a moment's hesitation. He also overheard the maids discussing Mistress Anastasia's whereabouts the previous day. This was information that troubled and haunted him. Anastasia always stood out for her confidence, especially after she'd managed to get revenge on that lady. They continued their conversations about the Duke, never forgetting his greatness. Word spread quickly. All the nobles knelt before the Duke, and it was a sign that they were a perfect match. The butler couldn't help but notice how at that moment Anastasia showed her cunning and charm, like a real fox, manipulating the situation. At that moment, one of the maids approached the butler, and he asked her with interest what had happened, because something was clearly happening. She announced with a smile that Mistress Anastasia had asked her to convey something important. The butler became wary, waiting to hear what would happen next. The maid handed him a jar of ointment and said it was an excellent remedy for back pain. The butler, somewhat surprised, asked if it really was from his mistress. The maid, without hesitation, explained that Anastasia herself had provided the ointment and attended to the maids. This surprised the butler, but he said nothing. She added with genuine admiration how her mistress had cared for her when she was injured. Anastasia had treated her herself and said that such a thing could happen to anyone. The maid admitted she was very happy to have Anastasia in their home, as she was always ready to support them. However, the butler wasn't as happy as everyone else. The entire estate was delighted by Anastasia's arrival, and the servants admired her abilities. The butler, however, felt only bewilderment and slight unease. Anastasia became like a fox, captivating everyone around her, and even the butler could not remain indifferent, observing her influence. In the morning, Anastasia finally woke up, feeling a strange feeling of fatigue and pain in her body, not understanding what exactly was bothering her. She tried to remember what had happened that night, but only after a moment did she realize why her body ached. Memories of that man came back to her, and she felt a slight twinge of embarrassment. Even if she hadn't succeeded in seducing him, it would still have been something important to her. Anastasia began to think that perhaps, even if she couldn't win his heart, she would still inevitably fall in love with him. Meanwhile, the Duke approached Anastasia and noticed that she had finally woken up, although she looked a little surprised by her awakening. She glanced at him and quietly asked how long he'd been watching her. He asked her to just continue to rest and not worry. Anastasia didn't quite understand what the Duke was talking about when he said the pain would last for several days. This left her perplexed. The Duke carefully lifted her into his arms, explaining that this was exactly what the doctor had said. Anastasia felt a strange uneasiness at his words. The girl was surprised, but tried not to think about how the Duke might discuss her condition with the doctor. It wasn't a pleasant moment for her. She thought they might have just gotten too carried away, lost track of time, and that led to this outcome. But she wasn't sure. He seemed a little worried, asking if everything was okay. After all, the doctor had said she would feel much better after a warm bath. To make her feel better, he prepared a bath of rose petals for her. Anastasia, not expecting this, asked if she could ask him a question. The Duke was pleased by her interest and, slightly embarrassed, asked what she wanted to know. He was prepared to answer, but he didn't know what her question would be. Anastasia looked at him closely and asked if he'd ever been intimate with women. It was an unexpected question, but she was curious. The Duke was surprised to hear such a question and replied that he was curious why she was asking that particular question, especially after he had been so helpless yesterday. Anastasia hastened to assure him that this was absolutely not the case. She simply didn't understand how he could be so good if this was his first experience. She couldn't help but notice how his body moved with such slowness and grace, and his face was surprisingly pleasant, which made her feel special. She said quietly that it had been a really nice first time, and her words carried not only gratitude, but also a slight surprise at what was happening. The gentleman was genuinely surprised by the lady's words when she said her ex-husband had never touched her. This offended him, but he didn't ask any further questions. She admitted she'd never experienced true love. The Duke paused. He understood that this was incomprehensible to her, as if love didn't exist for her. He noticed that the lady was overly proactive, which could have been due to the fact that this was her first experience. This made him wary, but also intrigued. The lady blushed and confessed that she didn't know what love was. This struck him as both naive and touching, as if she were just beginning to explore the world of emotions. The Duke remarked that he liked this. He thought she still had questions, and perhaps she didn't fully understand everything that was happening between them. But the lady, with interest in her eyes, wondered if he could answer all the questions she might want to ask. This was a test for her, a way to check his knowledge. The Duke smiled and replied that he was capable of answering anything she asked him. But he warned her that this man, despite his answers, could be dangerous to her heart. The lady, emerging from the bath, said it wasn't just a one-night stand. She felt she enjoyed it, and perhaps the feeling wasn't one-sided. The Duke was truly magnificent, his body in perfect shape. This couldn't help but impress her, and she couldn't hide her admiration for his physical attractiveness. Rumors from the servants said he was secretive and didn't like to reveal his secrets. That was her perception, but she understood that there was more to this secrecy. Now she could understand what this secrecy meant to him. It wasn't just privacy, but rather an attempt to protect himself from the outside world, to maintain his personal space. Come to think of it, she knew next to nothing about him. She could only judge him by his appearance and rumors, but his origins remained a mystery to her, as did his prowess in combat. Anastasia had long believed Duke Can-Etan to be a cruel and unfeeling man, but she soon realized he had a caring side. It was difficult to fathom the life he'd lived, but it was clearly not a simple existence. Anastasia's curiosity grew. She wondered what secrets the Duke was hiding. Then she noticed a strange mark on her neck, a bite mark, which only added to her questions. The song she'd heard remained a mystery to her. However, looking down at herself, Anastasia realized her entire neck was covered in hickeys, which confused her even more. In despair, she screamed, accusing the Duke of being nothing but a jerk. But standing in front of the mirror, she saw that the Duke too had suffered hickeys, which seemed to give him a sense of victory. Unfortunately, her master could not find the words to explain the situation because, according to him, the points were dead, and this changed everything that had previously seemed obvious. Anastasia realized that with such a terrible outcome, she would not be able to get married, because due to the loss of her arm, her situation became absolutely hopeless, and all her plans collapsed. She began to think she would no longer be of any use to her family. Her fate had become unprofitable, and now her life in her birth family was doomed to nothing. However, he suddenly noticed that she had stopped breathing, and this filled him with horror. He realized something was wrong, and his anxiety intensified. Panicked, he pulled her out of the coffin and anxiously asked if she was okay, not understanding what had happened. Everything that was happening seemed extremely strange and incongruous. He was certain that this had all been the Duke's plan, and that he had sent her here for his own personal reasons. This thought tormented him, but he didn't know how to deal with it. Anastasia explained that what had happened to her was a warning from the Duke. Everything that had happened was part of his game, and now she understood that it had all been planned. Seeking the truth, she asked her father if the Duke had really ordered him to leave their lands and come here. Her father confirmed her suspicions that it was the Duke's orders. She blamed the Duke for what was happening, believing he never expected things to go this far. He could have avoided this turn of events, she believed, but now nothing could be done. Isabella looked intimidating, but her words were calm. She remarked that it was simply magnificent, adding that it was the result of care that caused pain. She didn't seem to be planning to take offense at the Duke. Isabella maintained her composure and showed no signs of displeasure, despite the entire situation. And judging by her reaction, she didn't know it was her father who had slipped poison into the wine, which brought her some relief. This allowed the Duke to relax a little. The Duke embraced his daughter, deeply pained for her. He expressed his sincere regret that she had found herself in such a situation. He added that he would never allow anyone to hurt her like that again, assuring her that he would continue to protect her no matter how difficult it was. The Duke was soon informed that Lady Brill had returned home safely. This news calmed him somewhat and brought some clarity to the current situation. It seems that everything went according to plan to fulfill the Duke's hidden intentions. Some important steps were completed and everything was handed over with due care. The Duke, delighted by the good news, said everything was indeed excellent, but added that developments needed to be monitored further. However, the young man still could not understand where Hyde had disappeared to, because he had not been seen for quite some time, which made him uneasy. The Duke replied that Hyde had gone on vacation, which sounded somewhat surprising for someone accustomed to working non-stop. The reasons remained a mystery. The young man, not understanding this decision, objected, asking why they were suddenly allowed to do that. He considered it unacceptable and disrespectful. The Duke calmly stated that he felt no need to account for his decisions. He added that it was his personal business, and he had no obligation to explain his actions to anyone. He also noted that if the boy continued to complain, he would have to bury him alive, as he put it, and noted that the gentleman had a mistress. The boy was surprised to learn this from those who had recently seen him off to graduation. The Duke confirmed the information was true, and it was a familiar fact to him. The boy continued his questioning and asked if she really was beautiful. The Duke, smiling, replied that she was pretty, though he was surprised that this girl was Ein's lover. Duke Khan Eitan turned to John Kutar, asking if he truly believed he had any choice in the matter. His gaze was stern, his voice decisive. Ian quickly replied that everything was fine and that he just wanted to survive. The Duke looked at him and said there was no point in wasting time on unnecessary thoughts. He simply needed to do as he was told. The Duke added that Ian should no longer pay attention to his mistress, no matter how much it attracted him. He should focus on more important things. Despite the instructions, Ian couldn't help but think about the woman who had caught his attention. In the desert, his thoughts had been preoccupied with survival, but now everything was different. His interest in women hadn't faded. Meanwhile, Anastasia returned home. She was once again the center of attention after returning from her duties. Her return did not go unnoticed, and everyone awaited her instructions. The woman who seduced the Duke became the talk of the town. Her figure was shrouded in countless rumors, and everyone tried to understand the person behind her mysterious appearance. The current Duke of Canaitan's parents abandoned him when he was only 8 years old. By decision of the previous duke, he was sent abroad for an extended period. This was a difficult period in the young Eitan's life, and he did not see his parents for a long time. Beyond this information, however, nothing else is known about the duke. He spoke of his family, and others were unable to provide details of his past. The mystery of his life remained unsolved. No one knew about him or his past. So the lady was completely surprised to learn this. All her questions about the duke remained unanswered, and her interest only grew. She couldn't understand how it was that no one knew anything about the duke. It all made her think. Perhaps she should ask him directly about his life and secrets? However, she doubted he would give her an honest answer. At first, she felt it had nothing to do with her business, and she decided to leave the matter alone. But now she was worried about something more. Who was this man? What was his family hiding? Why was his past so carefully concealed? She felt she had to get to the bottom of it. She wanted to know if all the women of the Eitan family had truly suffered, as rumors claimed. This thought haunted her, and she decided to try to uncover the family's secrets. And then, at some point, she noticed something strange. Her aura, her sensations, everything seemed unusual. She couldn't understand what was happening and decided to focus on the situation. Turning around, she saw a group of men standing nearby. At first, she thought they were assassins, but quickly realized they didn't look like what she expected. Moreover, one of the men approached her, covered her mouth, and showed her a sign stating that they weren't murderers, but people with a different purpose. She felt relieved, but still wary. She still didn't understand what was happening. The men looked sloppy, and the cards were marked with notices telling her not to scream. They claimed they were there to make a deal, but she found it hard to believe. The faces of these people were tired, like scouts, and she immediately thought they might be Hyde's reconnaissance team. Her suspicions proved correct, and she realized she was dealing with a serious situation. These people offered her their terms. They wanted her to leave whenever she wanted and offered 3 shifts in exchange for vacation, but she wasn't sure whether to agree to such terms. Anastasia said that she heard their words, but wanted to understand what she would receive in return for her cooperation. The men told her that she would receive information about the Duke, and she asked if they could really provide such information. They confirmed that the Duke had given permission and that she would only receive the information she needed after signing the agreement. Anastasia was surprised that the Duke had demanded permission. He had agreed to the leak, but everything would depend on her decision after the agreement. She couldn't understand how the Duke had learned of her investigation, so she said she was forced to agree to their terms. Because of this, she agreed and expressed a desire to find out whether the rumor about the Eitan family's psychological problems was true. The men informed her that this would be her first question. Anastasia realized the question was too direct and immediately attracted their attention. After a short consultation, they replied that this was not the case. Men have selfishness, but they are devoted to love, although this creates great side effects. They added that they want to receive as much love as they give, and this is calculated on a deep level. They believe that the problem lay in their excessive honesty and desire to get more and more, and this also applied to the Duke, who was a lonely and misunderstood man. The men placed their hands on the table in front of her, but she didn't understand what the gesture meant in the context of their conversation. They informed her that the response was complete, and she now had to fulfill her obligations, which meant that her decisions were final and everything was under her control. She, in turn, agreed to provide them with the necessary conditions, and this concession of hers made them happy, because they knew that she always kept her promises. When they left, they began to quickly move away. Although they did not say anything important at the end, they only expressed their sympathy and declared that they loved her, which left a strange feeling. The Duke sent his reconnaissance team, as he had promised earlier, specifying that he was ready to answer any questions she wanted to ask and provide all the necessary clarifications. This could have been done to demonstrate trust in her, as the intelligence group was an important part of his power and the information he used to make decisions. This kind of attention from the Duke was slightly touching because his intelligence service, despite its strictness, seemed something personal and important to him, so he trusted it. The guy standing next to him was in complete shock because all his colleagues were going on vacation and he had to work alone, which seemed unfair and sad to him. The Count, turning to the Duke, expressed a request for a meeting, claiming that this issue required immediate discussion, but the Duke, as usual, simply said that he was too lazy to do so. In response to the Count's request, the Duke suggested that his butler pass on the information and say that the Count could come to him in the afternoon, hoping that this would resolve the situation. However, the Duke's master noticed that the butler had probably gotten hurt somewhere, since his behavior seemed somewhat unusual, which suggested a possible injury or trouble. The Duke had back pain, and he used a remedy given to him by Anastasia. She was always ready to help, giving useful medicines. He knew he could trust her. The Duke was somewhat surprised and asked why she had decided to give him the medicine. He was unaccustomed to such attention and was slightly perplexed by her action. The butler explained that Anastasia had given medicine not only to him but to the other servants as well. She took care of everyone, ensuring that no one suffered from minor ailments. He didn't think she wanted anything in return. He considered her actions to be an act of kindness. But the Duke couldn't understand why she did it. The butler wondered if this meant Anastasia truly cared about him. He couldn't be sure, but something about her actions made him think so. He wasn't entirely sure if she cared about him, but he couldn't deny that it felt good to have someone thinking about you. It was a new feeling for him. Anastasia clearly had a way of touching people. Her actions sometimes seemed unexpected, but they always resonated with those who knew her. She was special. The Duke was lost in thought, and the butler stood nearby, unsure of what to do. The situation was unclear, and he didn't know how to react. He said that if the Duke had no further business, he needed to leave to attend to his own affairs. The butler was prepared to leave him unless otherwise instructed. The Duke nodded and said that, from now on, he would be more attentive to Anastasia. Her actions and words now seemed more important and meaningful to him. The butler was a little alarmed to hear this. He knew the Duke could be unpredictable, and he wasn't sure he could handle the Duke's new attention. When Anastasia entered, she greeted Jack. She held a beautiful bouquet of flowers and looked special, as if she were preparing for an important meeting. The butler thought that perhaps the lady was planning to go out. After all, she usually spent her days in her room, and such behavior seemed unusual to him. But Anastasia replied that she wasn't going anywhere. She was just feeling a little dizzy, and decided to go outside for a quick walk. He thanked her for helping him with the ointment, which had truly helped him. He was sincerely grateful for her care and attention to his condition. The lady said there was no need to worry, everything would be fine. However, she was mistaken, as his interactions with people could have played a role. If he gave anything away, it was odorless. Anastasia planned to hand it over to the maid separately, so there was no need to worry. Everything had to be done carefully, without unnecessary fuss. She wished him luck in his work, as it was time for her to leave. Time was running out, and she felt she had to move on. But the butler unexpectedly addressed her again. He asked Anastasia to take care of the Duke. It was important to him. Anastasia was surprised by his request and replied that if he didn't trust her, he'd hardly understand why she'd help him with this at all. She barely knew the Duke. Sometimes she wonders if the Duke is really like other people. Other times, she notices his behavior is unusual, not entirely clear. He's a man who doesn't express emotions. She doesn't know exactly what his life has been like. All she could guess was his bland appearance. She wasn't sure if he'd always been this cold. And, frankly, she wondered about it too. It seemed like he was hiding something. Perhaps the butler could tell her a little about the Duke. It might shed light on his behavior, giving her more understanding. He began to talk about the Duke's childhood, how difficult it had been. It was a profound revelation that could explain a lot. He noted that the Duke's childhood was harsh and full of trials. Perhaps this helped shape his personality, making him who he is. The older generations who lived on this estate knew well that Master Kang was the heir to his family line. His position was clear, beyond any doubt. As a child, Khan never received the care and attention a child in a family typically deserves. He grew up alone and without support. After the tragic loss of his parents, he was forced to go to war. He lived solely to survive these harsh conditions. Khan was a master of martial arts. He could teach how to kill a person, but he had no skills to be a normal person in society. The problem wasn't that he didn't feel emotions, but that he simply didn't know how to express them. His feelings remained inside, hidden and repressed. Khan couldn't heal his childhood traumas. Every time he looked at his master, his heart sank with pain. The memories of the past were too heavy. However, after he met Anastasia, something changed in his soul. He began to feel and perceive the world differently, and this was inevitable. Over time, Khan realized he could learn human warmth. The butler closely monitored this process, noticing how his master was changing. Khan knew he couldn't easily trust Anastasia, but he sincerely asked her to stay with him as long as possible. He felt he needed her. Although Khan knew it would be difficult for him to open up, he was still grateful that Anastasia was there for the Duke, helping him cope with his emotions. Despite the difficulties in her relationships with men, Anastasia could not understand how to properly establish a relationship with the Duke so that everything would be harmonious. These thoughts had been haunting her for the past few days. When the butler offered her a book about supporting love, she pondered his words. Anastasia never expected Jack to say something like that. He was always reserved and did everything strictly by the book, but his words caught her off guard. In any case, she decided to see this through. If things didn't end as she planned, maybe she should just start dating the Duke. Casa advised her not to hesitate and just do it. Sometimes it's important to just move forward without wasting time on doubts and let things be as they are. Anastasia turned to him and, remaining with the man, asked how long he'd been there. Her interest in this question arose quite naturally since she hadn't known him for so long. He smiled and replied that he had been there all along. Everything that was happening around him was part of his life, and she had to understand that. But a relationship with the Duke, it's really normal, the guy said confidently. If something was wrong, she would have noticed by now. But for now, everything seemed perfectly natural. He confirmed his words, adding that if she decided not to meet with the Duke, he, of course, would not condemn her, although he doubted her decision. Anastasia hesitantly replied that that wasn't true. She simply wasn't sure whether it was worth moving forward so quickly, but she decided she had to take the risk. The guy, unable to understand her doubts, said it was her life, and she decided who she dated. Everything else was her choice, and he didn't interfere. She thought there might be consequences to all this, but the guy repeated that they were just dating and there was no need to worry too much about it. Anastasia was a person who always overthought. Sometimes her overthinking became her problem, causing her to get lost in details and doubts. Her plans were always meticulous and perfect, but even she understood that no one could be immune from unexpected turns of fate, especially in their world. Can Eitan tried to reassure her, assuring her that if anything went wrong, he would take care of everything. She didn't need to worry because he would always be there to help. The lady smiled back, listening to his words. He suggested she simply let go of all her worries and move on, not letting fears dictate her decisions. He was sure that she should, at least once in her life, make a choice in favor of her own happiness, without succumbing to the pressure of circumstances or other people's expectations. Anastasia couldn't hide her affection for the Duke. This feeling became sufficient reason for her to step into the unknown, despite the risks. Can Eitan assured her that she shouldn't worry about the consequences, not dwelling on what would happen next. She simply needed to say what she felt and move forward. Anastasia thanked him for his support, promising that she would soon decide everything and take a step in the direction she had long been considering, despite her doubts. Can Eitan assured her that he didn't care whether she had a lover or a husband. What mattered most to him was her happiness and confidence in her decisions, not giving in to the opinions of others. He had made his decision long ago. He would protect this girl who had once given him an apple. It wasn't just a gesture, but a symbol of how much he valued her. When he was dying of hunger on the cold street, she approached him without thinking, handed him an apple, and his life suddenly took on meaning. She saved him, and it wasn't by accident. This relationship won't be like those that end after a breakup. Here, everything is different. The connection is much deeper, and they don't just pass by, they remain for each other. For him, she had already become part of his family, and these weren't just words. He would be with her until the end of his days, no matter what. Everything else became unimportant. She's already become his family, and that gives him a sense of peace and security. For him, that's enough to move on with his life, knowing she's always there. He's genuinely glad she's found happiness and grateful for it. However, deep down, he hoped she'd discuss it with Gray. He couldn't shake the thought. The Tojo nobles, upon seeing their master, began apologizing, raising their tails. This seemed to indicate that the Duke was somewhat inattentive and lost in his thoughts. The Duke noticed that his master was often lost in thought. He looked thoughtful, as if something was tormenting him. Eitan was clearly not in his usual form. Everything about Anastasia, from her skin to her breath, was incredibly important to him. He constantly returned to these thoughts, and every moment spent with her left an imprint. The way she touched him, her arched eyebrows, it was all imprinted in his memory. Every movement of hers became important and unforgettable for him. Everything felt right in her presence, and it brought him inner joy. He couldn't help but smile when he thought about how she looked and how she felt. While it all sounds perfectly reasonable, he still can't quite put his finger on what exactly it means to him. Why does his heart beat so hard around her? At this point, Count Brill, understanding the situation, informed his nobles of the Duke's arrival. This was a momentous event that required due attention and preparation. He didn't expect the gentleman to agree. It seemed the Duke would refuse, but he turned out to be unexpectedly accommodating. The Duke clarified what he had just said, and the boy only responded with confusion. The Duke asked again, wondering what exactly he had agreed to. The Count explained that it was about attending noble gatherings. He paused, unsure of the purpose. The Duke asked again with displeasure, clarifying that the Count had told him about this long ago. The young man, however, couldn't understand why he needed to attend these meetings and began to complain again. The Count couldn't understand why his objections were so irritating. After all, he himself had said he liked the idea. However, the Duke reminded him that he hadn't mentioned such meetings, and that was his concern. The Count asked what good had happened in his life that had made him suddenly decide to do this. He couldn't understand what had changed and why everything now looked like this. The Duke replied coldly that it was none of his business. He clearly didn't want to share the details of his life and remained in his silent, closed world, not opening up to his interlocutor. The Count remarked that this might be related to his personal life, perhaps because he was in love, but the Duke hastened to reply that, in fact, he was fine. He added cautiously that his desire to marry had nothing to do with emotions. If she couldn't accept him, all his efforts would be in vain and everything would go wrong. The Count, hearing the Duke's words, realized he would leave this to him, referring to matters related to the asylum. He decided not to interfere in the matter and let the Duke handle things his way. At that moment, he believed the Duke had already begun to notice the hints that would lead to further action. It was obvious, but it still required time and patience. However, the gentleman said that he hadn't noticed anything yet, but was sure it would happen someday. His words were calm, but they contained a hidden confidence in the future. He, if the opportunity presented itself, was to take charge of the matter himself, before the Duke made a final decision. This meant he had to act quickly and precisely. It was strange to see the gentleman so concerned about another person, especially one under his care. It added a new dimension to their relationship and approach to business. No matter how stern and decisive the Duke was, he showed incredible kindness to his beloved, which was actually quite romantic. This attitude made others think. The Earl thought it would be wonderful if the Duke showed the same concern for both him and Jack. He believed their relationship could be more open if there was more mutual respect. The Count himself felt that. Watching the Duke endure such hardships, he understood the importance of words and support. Even the simplest words could have enormous meaning for those who heard them. But the Duke seemed unwilling to listen to these reflections. He declared that if the Count wished to hear such things, he could find another master. This statement was direct and stern. The Count realized it was impossible to change the Duke's mind, and this greatly irritated him. He also couldn't help but notice that he wanted to know when the lady and the Duke would begin dating. Just a few months ago, he was fighting on the battlefield, and now he was being crowned at a funeral. It seemed strange and almost unbelievable that he had accomplished this so quickly. He wondered when it all began. Perhaps from the day he signed the contract with Anastasia. The intrigue grew in his thoughts. Maybe it happened after their first kiss, or after the night they spent together. The Duke decides to say that they met last winter. That's how it all began. The Count was surprised he knew nothing about it. The Duke replied that it didn't matter how long they'd been together, it didn't matter anyway. The Count considered this, agreeing that perhaps it didn't matter. But perhaps it did, and no one had yet decided how to perceive it. But if their relationship is casual, without promises or commitments, it might not be entirely right. It's unclear what they mean to each other. Their relationship could be vague, a little ambiguous. For example, they could simply have fun, without ever considering each other anything more serious. If she decides to date someone else, there won't be any complaints. And although the Count had nothing to say, the Duke was incredibly angry. He was not pleased with such statements, which seemed to call his feelings into question. He said abruptly that he needed to meet with Anastasia immediately, urgently. There was no longer any time to put it off. His words were filled with tension. The Duke left the room, and Anastasia entered almost immediately. Her arrival came just as things were starting to get heated. The Duke sat down, and the Count suddenly froze. He was so surprised that he didn't even know what to say when he saw Anastasia. Anastasia entered with a smile, clearly about to tell the Duke something. She was ready to make an important confession, which now seemed inevitable.